Raiding's been one of my favourite parts of World of Warcraft for the longest time. Overcoming the tough bosses, going through progression, and of course getting purple items are all things which WoW has been consistently amazing at over its duration. And when Classic released in 2019, many of us got a chance to go back and experience how raiding began all of those years ago. We got to face bosses which we never could back in the day, or to just see how they were firsthand after having heard so much about them. Because before Classic relived the trilogy of Vanilla, TBC and Wrath for the first time, you certainly heard many stories about raiding back then, mainly surrounding the time investment, the grind, and of course, how difficult things used to be. Some of those remain true, others by today's standards didn't quite hold up so well. As by today, with PCs which can manage above 5 FPS in a raid, all our add-ons and a ton more game knowledge, many bosses fell over pretty easily. But things definitely got more challenging as time went on, all the way from Lucifron in Molten Core to the Lich King himself in his own expansion. And sometimes underestimating an encounter or somebody making a big mistake was all it took to derail the fight, because bosses might have been simple, but they could also be quite punishing as well. So today I'm going to be going over what I felt as though were 10 of the most challenging encounters from the classic trilogy of Vanilla, the Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King, and I'll mainly be focusing on how long the fight took to complete back in the day and how difficult it was seen, how did it compare on its re-release, what made it so difficult, and some stats on the fights as well where I can. So all that said, let's make a start. Unsurprisingly, there won't be too many additions from Vanilla here, as simply put, a lot of the content from World of Warcraft's start was on the simple side. But the first entry I have from Vanilla is the iconic 4 Horsemen encounter. Originally it was estimated that around 0.1 to 0.2 of the active player base actually cleared Naxxramas in 2006, and you can only imagine back then having the doors open to the end of the military quarter only to be faced with 4 bosses, and what will be a mechanically challenging fight to figure out, as so many people need to be doing different things at the same time. On Naxx's re-release, of course, this was blasted through at record pace by top guilds who had more than just a bit of experience on other servers when it came to this content, but the 4 Horsemen fight could still prove a tricky encounter. The big step up and what makes this fight so infamous is that you need to have 4 very geared tanks and 4 well enough geared off tanks. Typically you need 2 tanks in a raid and some off tanks depending on the fight, so this came as quite the shock. The reason was that each of the bosses needed to be moved to a separate corner at the start of the fight. You might remember in Wrath of the Lich King they ran off to their corners by themselves. They didn't do this in Vanilla. Throughout the fight, everyone close to one of the 4 bosses gained a mark, and these marks stacked. The more marks you have, the more damage they dealt, and these marks became lethal very fast. This means the bosses under no circumstances can be moved once they're in position, and everyone must rotate around the room periodically to ensure their mark stacks from one boss don't become too high. This means making sure enough healers are in range of the tanks, that there's an active tank on the boss, and that there's enough DPS distributed around the room to make sure the bosses are actually dying. Each boss had an ability too. Mograine just slapped the tank about really hard with Righteous Fire. Blammo puts a void zone on the floor, seems easy to dodge, but if it hits you it's more or less going to one-shot you. Korthas summons meteors that do split damage between targets, and Zeliek does some chain lightning holy beam type thing, which means you need to be spread. Once you get the rotations down and each person understands what needs doing, it's not too difficult of a fight, but at first there is a lot happening all at once, and if you wipe on a boss in Vanilla and lose those world buffs, the next pull the fight is going to be about 30% harder, and this fight is really easy to wipe on, especially when you're progressing, so that's why I think it deserves a mention here. Next is the second entry from Vanilla, and it's going to be the final boss of this version of the game, Kel'Thuzad. In 2006, the world first kill of this boss by Nihilum took place about 2.5 months after the release of this legendary raid, and on its re-release, KT fell about 90 minutes after the raid opened. Times sure change, huh? But that doesn't mean it was a free encounter by any means. In fact, by the end of the second reset during Classic, only 19% of guilds who had defeated at least one boss in Naxxramas had gone on to defeat KT. But if your guild was capable of beating 4 Horseman and Sapphiron, they could definitely clear Kel'Thuzad. And you know, Ragnaros, Cthulhu and Kel'Thuzad all shared something in common which made their encounters a bit more complicated than most vanilla bosses, and that was that you are forced to spread your raid out at all times or disaster would shortly follow. For Ragnaros, it was all about his splash damage and Hand of Rag, Cthulhu of course his iconic Eye Beam, and Kel'Thuzad was Mana Detonation, Void Zone and Frost Blast. All the ranged had to be spread around the room to make sure mechanics didn't overlap, and the melee had to be in very tightly stacked groups, as Frost Blast would do more than your maximum percentage health over a few seconds, and it would hit all nearby players, so if you were strafe spamming a bit and hit another group, that could easily be a wipe. The Void Zones would also instantly one-shot you if you moved too slow. The boss would also cast Frostbolt Volley on the whole raid, which if you didn't partially resist would really do a lot of damage. And let's not forget about the mind control effect either. Players had to react fast to CC affected players so they didn't mess up raid positioning or just start one-shotting people themselves. At low health, 2 adds would be called into the room that needed to be tanked until the boss died, but that didn't really add much difficulty to the encounter. The biggest threats on Kel'Thuzad were a bad Frost Blast taking out your melee group, or somebody tanking getting hit by the mind control and you had to react fast before people start getting wiped out. A classic vanilla fight where it's all very simple in theory, but the mechanics that exist are actually very punishing if they go wrong. And yes, there is the first phase which I'm still trying to mentally block and not mention here, but I guess I have to, and I don't know, I guess somebody thought it showed the endless numbers of the Scourge and the power of the boss, but man was it boring to sit through 5 minutes of trash slowly coming towards you. Either way, Kel'Thuzad was the final boss of vanilla and he very much earns that title. Next we venture forth from vanilla and on into the Burning Crusade, World of Warcraft's first expansion and a big step up in difficulty when it came to endgame encounters. The first entry from this expansion is going to be Kael'thas, the final boss of Tempest's Keep, also known as the Eye. There was a big difference here between the classic release and how things were in 2007 though, as back then all bosses from tier 4, so Karazhan, Gruul and Magtheridon, tier 5, Tempest's Keep and Serpent Shrine Cavern, and Mount Hyjal, the start of tier 6, were available on the launch of the expansion, so players had an incredible volume of new content to get their teeth stuck into, whereas in Classic the content was split up, so we got tier 4 and then a few months later tier 5 and so on. Because of this, it took 130 days from launch before Kael'thas was finally defeated for the first time, whereas in Classic the boss fell over very shortly post-launch as per usual. However, we did get the pre-nerf version of Kael'thas, whereas it took until after patch 2.1 was released and the opening of the Black Temple before he fell in 2007. What made this fight tough was the learning in getting each part of it correct, from fighting the advisors one by one, taking on the legendary weapons, fighting all the advisors together, and then finally getting onto the proper boss fight. And of course any wipe will lead to a big run back all the way to the boss, as well as having to sit through several minutes of him hyping up his crew all over again. It got old really fast. The boss also focused on spells instead of melee attacks, and allowing any cast to complete or standing in flame strike could be very dangerous, so interrupts and care on your positioning was key. Of course, it wouldn't be a boss in the Burning Crusade if it didn't have some kind of mind control effect, and this one had to be broken by somebody using one of the legendary weapons acquired during the fight. In the final phase, he lifts everyone into the air and you have to stay spread to not get nuked by his chain lightning attack called Nether Beam, while still interrupting and getting through the last of his health bar. Taking this lengthy fight piece by piece, it's not too difficult to get down, but it's just putting it all together and executing it correctly where the problems can lie, and just losing the odd person here and there to random damage or mistakes could be enough to spiral a good attempt back into another run back and another few minutes of forced RP. At 7 we have another entry from TBC, and this one comes quite late into the expansion from the Sunwell Muru. This boss above so many others has a famous legacy for its difficulty, and in fact it was the only boss not to be released in a fully pre-nerf state during Classic. In the final phase of this boss, it constantly hits the raid with ramping damage, and originally this caused spell knockback, which made casters more or less just not be able to do damage, but this was removed as it was deemed more frustrating than challenging. Originally, TBC Muru took 62 days to be defeated, though his release was staggered from launch alongside the Eredar twins and Kill J Maiden. It was also this boss which, again back in the day, gave rise to a type of min-maxing which just wasn't as widely appreciated at the time. Players were stacking leatherworking to spam a haste buff via the Drums of Battle item, and this interaction was changed in Classic so you only needed 1 leatherworker per group instead of 4. The challenge here from the encounter was, well, all of it really. For the moment the fight began, it felt as though the race was on. The first phase sees packs of adds and Void Sentinels spawn in, which you have to keep on top of before the next set arrive. It's a big DPS race though, as these adds come in at a really fast pace. If you lose people, fall behind on damage, a tank doesn't pick up all the adds, whatever it may be, if something goes wrong, you're gonna wipe. The one thing that could make this encounter way easier on progression though was just bringing more warlocks. There are small adds during the fight that could be subjugated, which could then spam a Shadow Bolt volley for huge damage. I remember coming into this fight one time on my tier 5 geared warlock, and it was only the other warlocks that were doing more damage than me. These adds were really overpowered. But once the boss reaches 0 health for the first time, the second phase starts, and this is where the real race begins, and you have to get the boss's health to 0 before he does the same to you. It was a fun fight and one which I probably could have put higher on the list, but its redeeming features in this regard were no mind control effects for once, a very short run back, and a low level of personal responsibility from most raid members. You just needed to do a lot of healing and damage. Next is my first entry from Wrath of the Lich King, and if we can say that the Burning Crusade was a step up in difficulty, Wrath of the Lich King was a leap up in difficulty. Well, from Ulduar and beyond it was anyway. Tier 7, not so much. But my first pick from Wrath is Mimmeron 25 hard mode, aka the infamous Firefighter achievement. Back in the day, Ulduar was hotfixed time and again very early on over concerns of it being crazy overtuned, but we got the pre-nerf version of the raid. Even still, Mimmeron hard mode was completed 2 weeks after its launch in 2009 by Insidia, which is really impressive going, to be honest. For us on our re-release, by the end of the second reset, it had just under 600 kills, making it into one of the harder fights in Ulduar. But Mimmeron showed who had been paying attention in your raid and who had gotten a little bit too used to standing at the back of the room and casting Fireball, because there was random damage everywhere. Get hit by a shock blast, that's a one-shot, rocket launch, one-shot, frost bomb, one-shot, missile barrage, one-shot, stand in the fire, I mean, not quite one-shot, but it's not going to be very good for you. And the fight was also timed as soon as you press the big red button, where you have 10 minutes to take down the various different parts of the boss. At the end of the encounter, all 3 parts would combine together into Voltron, where the boss would use abilities from each phase of the fight, and it became even more chaotic than it already was. Between the ever-spreading fire and the half-full dozen or so lethal abilities which you needed to track, Mimmeron Hard Mode 25 was not an encounter where you could ever take your foot off the pedal, and every player just had to understand what he did, or you're gonna end up on the floor every single pull. For me, it was definitely one of the better and more challenging bosses of Wrath of the Lich King, and very worthy of a spot on this list. At number 5 is the first entry from Icecrown Citadel, the infamous Professor Putricide encounter. ICC was another raid which was way different back in the day. Not only was each wing released in a staggered fashion, but to even start heroic mode, you had to have defeated the Lich King on normal mode already. We didn't have to deal with either of those in our re-release, but something we did keep were attempts. Between the end of the win bosses and the Lich King, you would have 50 attempts total per reset, which put a cap on the number of attempts you had, so you really had to perfect each fight to have as many attempts possible on the harder bosses. Compared to normal mode, Professor Putricide is one of the fights that gets the most changes on heroic, as you have to play out each phase transition with its various oozes. The hardest part comes from raid-wide awareness, and of course the dreaded personal responsibility here. The green ooze will root and run to somebody and do split damage, so people will need to stack up with them, and the red one will chase one person. And when you get both of them at once, things get chaotic very fast. Heroic mode also introduced a plague that would deal ramping damage, and it would also leave behind a debuff, meaning the same person can't take it again for a bit, which further complicated positioning. But generally speaking, you just made sure you got it out to a ranged player and have them pass it around for a bit. it. The final phase was the hardest bit though, as the boss morphed into an abomination which did way more damage. He also applied a debuff to his active tank, and if they ever died he would heal a massive amount and you'd basically wipe. It could be a tough one to progress on, but it really felt rewarding to get down. Next we're taking a step back again to the Burning Crusade, and to be honest the past three between this boss, Professor Putricide and Mimiron are all relatively close together for me, but I think that this was overall the hardest encounter from TBC and it deserves some respect because of that, and that is Lady Vash. The original world first of the end boss of Serpent Shrine Cavern is shrouded in mystery, with Nihilum claiming it on March 29th, 2007 amidst rumours of bug abuse, whereas Method's famous world first legit kill came a bit over a month later on May 5th. Lady Vash was a very punishing fight and in my opinion was up there with Muru in terms of the hardest encounters during TBC, but for me it had a few things which made it stand out. The first phase was simple enough really, you just nuke the boss's health down a little bit before phase 2 and the real fight began. Here various ads would spawn in that had to be handled correctly, as well as the iconic tainted core passing from one person to the next before you dunk it in one of the pillars protecting the boss. If you take too long with the core they could despawn, or you get hit by another mechanic as you're trying to pass them, or it goes to the wrong person and so on. It was a strange and unique mechanic and they can always be a bit problematic to learn, but if you scored all the cores then you progress with the fight, and here's where things started to get a bit messy. First of all, spore bats will fly into the room and put poison everywhere, and the boss still did her regular mechanics, but biggest of all was the mind control, a mind control effect which was completely removed after patch 2.1 by the way. This would massively buff a player's damage, healing and movement speed, and most dangerously would make them immune to CC effects, so you had to get a tank over to taunt them as soon as possible. This mind control could make or break the fight, as sometimes the boss picked a caster who would proceed to nuke your raid before anyone could do anything about it. The difficulty on Vash was entirely on the last phase, as once things started to go bad, the mind control effect would completely snowball the fight out of control almost instantly, and that for me is why I'm ranking it so high on the list. We're moving into top 3 territory now, and I bet you even have a pretty good idea of the 3 which are going to be left to talk about. First up we have a trip back to Ulduar, and this time it's for the exclusively hard mode only boss, Algalon the Observer. With the literal fate of the world to be decided on the outcome of this fight, it's kind of a big deal. Back in the day it took just under 2 months of progression for Insidia to defeat this fight, and after 2 resets during Classic, 119 guilds had claimed a kill. Now to be honest, mechanically Algalon is a pretty straightforward fight, it's just if anything goes a little bit wrong, you wipe. Oh, also, he's hitting your tanks harder than any boss you've ever seen before in the game, and in the first few weeks at least, he could just decide your tank was going to die and there wasn't really much you could do about it. And there's this timer as well, because Blizzard loved putting limited attempts or time restrictions on bosses back then, and for Algalon you get 1 hour per week to progress this fight, and that timer starts the moment you first pull a boss, and that 1 hour goes by really fast when you're progressing. The biggest hurdle on this fight to get correct were the collapsing stars, so several stars would spawn in at once and would gradually lose health. When they died they would blast the entire raid for massive damage. This meant a player would be in charge of ensuring that they were damaged and died in a staggered fashion, as if you had 2 stars go off too close to one another it was just unhealable. After progressing the boss to 20% health, phase 2 would begin, and weirdly for Algalon, phase 2 felt completely free, as in when you got there you had a kill, because all the collapsing stars despawned and they were the problem mechanic in this fight. I think a number of fights I've already talked about were mechanically more challenging than Algalon, but a mix of the 1 hour timer, the crazy tank damage and how punishing the mechanics were really earning this spot on the list. At number 2 is Yogg-Saron Zero Lights. Now this is a bit of a weird fight because Zero Lights is not technically hard mode. 1 light counts for the hard mode loot, and 1 light is way easier. 0 lights is just for the achievement, the Mimiron's head mount guaranteed, and of course the flex. But 0 lights was by far the biggest challenge in Ulduar. Originally it took 85 days to beat, and by the end of the second reset there was 148 kills on Classic servers. So yes, Algalon did have fewer kills on Classic by the end of the second reset, but Yogg-Zero didn't have a 1 hour timer or any attempt limit. You could just bash your head against this boss as much as you wanted to. 0 lights, by the way, simply means no help from any of the keepers that you've rescued during the rest of the raid. So the fight starts as a test to see who can dodge a cloud and who can't. 8 ads need to die for the next phase to start next to the boss. Ads will spawn in by themselves, or if anyone touches a cloud in the room. If you spawn too many ads by accident, it is a wipe, and everyone has wiped to this, believe me. After that, the real boss fight begins, with a team going inside the portals to damage the brain, and others staying outside to deal with tentacles. Good old-fashioned personal responsibility and splitting the raid always makes the fight harder, and here is no exception. And since we're taking on the Zero Lights version of the fight, there was also no way to regain sanity. So if you get hit by mechanics, it's going to drain your sanity, and if you go to 0, you will be permanently mind controlled and have to die, and you can't even get combat res through this either. And sometimes the boss decided you're going insane this pull and just hit you with a targeted ability several times in a row. You can go insane by just getting unlucky on this fight. I've seen it happen a few times, in fact it's happened to me twice. Drain the brain to low health and Yog's shield will drop, leading to the final phase of the fight, and by far the hardest part of it on Zero Lights. Not only can you not restore sanity on Zero Lights, but the immortal guardians that spawn in the last phase are immortal. On one light, you always get the help of Thorim, who allows these ads to be killed when they reach low health, which makes the final phase pretty easy, to be honest, if you're patient. Zero Lights means it's a DPS race, because the ads hit extremely hard and eventually will just kill your tank and then rampage through the entire raid. What complicates this further is the lunatic gaze mechanic. This rapidly drains sanity to anyone who's facing the boss, and during this time most classes can't DPS. Most people need to be facing the boss to do damage. But there is one class and one spec specifically which absolutely excelled during this phase, and that was the Affliction Warlock. Not only was Affliction a top performer the whole way throughout Wrath of the Lich King, but you can continue to drain soul with your back turned, meaning you had close to 0 downtime effectively. Even back in 2009, when the Guild Stars scored their world first kill of this encounter, they were stacking Warlocks back then. And during Classic, again, you pretty much had to stack Warlocks to get a week 1 kill. Most guilds in Classic were taking somewhere between 7 to 9 Warlocks to beat the DPS check. During other fights in Classic, top guilds would class stack because it just makes sense to maximize your DPS. This was the first fight where you had to class stack just to beat it convincingly week 1, and that's why I think it deserves the number 2 spot. I do have an honorable mention before we get to the top spot, because in fact there is a boss that was never beaten pre-nerf in Classic. I guess technically this makes it the hardest boss ever, but it feels a bit weird saying it. Either way, the XT002 Deconstructor was never defeated in a pre-nerf stage during original Wrath of the Lich King or in Classic. This was the second encounter of Ulduar to feature a hard mode, and it was just crazy overtuned. It wasn't a hard fight per se, it was just the boss had so much health that it was mathematically impossible to beat him before he berserked and wiped your raid. Top guilds didn't even get close to killing it, and they did try, by the way. Most guilds didn't even bother, and you didn't need to do XT to reach Algalon either, so really, why put yourself through this? When Blizzard finally got round to nerfing XT, for example on 25-man, his hard mode health was lowered from 47.5 million to 25,200,000. The actual heart itself health was nerfed alongside the ads and his base health. After that, people started doing this fight and realizing it's not too bad, but for a moment we did have an unkillable encounter in Classic, which means at the top spot, and this really shouldn't come as a surprise I don't think, is Lich King 25 Heroic. Arthas is a legendary figure in the WoW universe, and a boss that not only appeared throughout the expansion, but had a whole expansion named after him. You already knew that final showdown with him was going to be a big deal, and this fight was hard. Paragon's first kill took place 46 days after the launch of Heroic, seeing this finish guild's rise to prominence in the WoW scene, a place they would keep throughout most of Cata as well. During Classic, Lich King 25 Heroic fell some mere 94 minutes post-launch by the guild progress. But don't let that fool you, this fight was anything but an easy mode push over Classic boss. Also, Classic saw 61 kills during the first 2 resets, with a pull to kill ratio of 0.5%. Were I covering Cata in this vid as well, Lich King 25 Heroic would still be at the number 1 spot, by the way. Memes aside about Classic bosses being easy, this one was definitely extreme week 1, and was was the second fight of Wrath of the Lich King that more or less required class stacking to beat. This time around it was all about the Unholy Death Knight, who were great at mitigating damage, dealt amazing bursts during their cooldowns and were ideal for the ads, as well as the Warlocks again. Here they were just good consistent damage dealers and absolutely trivialized the Valkyrie mechanic. In a later phase the Lich King would call down Valkyrie, who would try and throw somebody off the platform. Normally you needed a perfect CC rotation and tons of damage to stop them in time, but Warlocks could get thrown off and then just teleport back onto the platform via Demonic Circle. The difference between a pull where Warlocks didn't get grabbed and when they did was extremely noticeable. There was also the infamous Defile mechanic, where the boss would spawn a pull on top of somebody. You had about 1 second to rocket boost out of this thing before it grew in size and wiped the raid, so even if it just clipped one person, that could be it could be a wipe. Biggest of all for week 1 of the Lich King on 25 heroic was just how much damage you needed to be doing. If you were getting out of the first phase before the second big ad spawned, you were already doing really well. This fight was also extremely long with a 15-minute enrage timer, which most people either hit or were extremely close to hitting during their first kill, and each phase presented a number of new challenges that had to be executed perfectly while maintaining very high levels of performance from all members of the raid. In future weeks ICC gear helped out a lot, and then the raid-wide buff was also introduced, which made the fight much easier, but it still wasn't an entirely free fight, and anyone messing up Defile at any point would always be a wipe. But the loot was so very worth it, and you got Invincible guaranteed as a drop as well, which is a nice little bonus. But there we have it, what for me are 10 of the hardest bosses from the classic trilogy. I did want to include a bit of variety between different expansions in a subjective way too, because I think each version of WoW presented different challenges, from the world buffs and organization of vanilla, creating the perfect team comp in TBC and watching your threat, or the more cooldown and mechanics based Wrath of the Lich King. When World of Warcraft dropped in 2004, Blizzard had no idea what they had just unleashed, a game that would shape the lives of many, create lifetime fans, and expand a fantasy world over the space of nearly 2 decades. And a favourite pastime in the game for many has not been so much engaging in the war in Warcraft, it's been the PvE, dungeons, raids, gear chasing, the feeling of knowing that you can be the best in the world. Whether it was all for standing next to the mailbox in Ironforge in your full tier 2, being the first to own a legendary item, or just the bragging rights. You give a people a mountain and they will climb it. So I thought, why not cover it? As in, pretty much all of it. That is raiding competitively, from the time it was napkin maths and playing on a CRT monitor, all the way to having esport teams where they hire experts to analyze logs and create their own custom weak auras. Throughout this I'm going to try and focus on the big events that shape raiding, led to the rise and fall of famous guilds, and just how much things have changed over the years. Also, for the sake of the video not being excessively long, I'll be focusing on the hardest or largest raid clears, so no 10-man content, no covering multiple difficulties of the same tier. I've no doubt I'm going to miss out quite a few bits, but I hope to bring out the most interesting points from the race historically. I suppose we better make a start then. Vanilla, as in 2004 vanilla, not 2019 classic. Big difference there. You could drop aggro in raids by running far away enough from a boss, and chances are if a boss seemed too mathematically difficult, there may be a way to bug it out in one way or another. It was a real trial by fire at the time. Well, quite literally, the first 2 end bosses of World of Warcraft were Onyxia and Ragnaros, and, well, you can imagine how long it took for people to both work out exactly how to get into Onyxia's lair. It's even a totally different quest between the Horde and Alliance, and for Ragnaros, though you can just go into Molten Core, after attuning of course and starting to kill bosses, you need dowses, which of course means you have to have done the quest line and gotten the rep from an NPC who seems to have been placed deliberately in the most inconvenient possible location. I mean, come on, nobody wants to go to Ashara. It was definitely a simpler time, one that a lot of players look back to fondly, yet in these early days there were absolutely still those pushing for the world first clears and to perform as best as they could despite the minimal tools at their disposal. Onyxia lived for 69 days before being taken down, and Ragnaros in vanilla to this day is the boss that has taken the longest to kill, chilling in his lava pool for 154 days before being rudely awakened. Too soon, if you ask me. US Guild Ascent grabbed the first kill on the 25th of April 2005 on Horde, interestingly enough. If we have seen one change on Classic, it's how many top-end players choose to go Alliance for the PvE benefits nowadays. Classic's next raid in 1.6 was Blackwing Lair, where the boss Nefarian resided, releasing July 15th, 2005. Ascent were once again leading the race early, taking down Razorgore and Vale on the same day of release. The Lord of Blackrock Mountain took some time longer though, a total of 77 days before the guild drama landed the world first with a rather snappy 22-minute kill. Patch 1.9 saw the legendary war effort and some proper world first raiding drama. This came in the form of the last boss and some of the optional bosses, but mainly the last boss. Cthulhu. The Cthulhu on his release was historically named the mathematically impossible boss, both with video footage and a post made by Ian Hazzikostas himself, where he says basically anything you might think, it's been tried. After a couple of weeks of beating our heads against Phase 2 head on, we came to the conclusion there had to be some gimmick because the fight was impossible otherwise. The level of difficulty was such that, in an unprecedented move, members of very well-known guilds at the time, such as Elitist Jerks, Death and Taxes, Afterlight, Ascent, Immortality, and others, began to publicly discuss Cthulhu's strategies after 1.5 months of futile attempts on said boss. And it's important to remark that for the vast majority of world first races, that each and every guild was very much their own self-contained unit working solely towards getting the world first kill. There were no streams, no guides, no YouTube videos, no cross-guild discussions, and for the early days, no PTR testing. Over time, the race has become very heavily publicized, and much more of it is already known in advance. In time though, it turned out Cthulhu was just kind of buggy. Tentacles spawning in the stomach led to unavoidable death, getting knocked out of bounds, and so many other issues led to frustrations in the world first race for this boss. Eventually, the content was nerfed or fixed, pick whichever you will, and Nihilum grabbed the first ever world first for Europe. The old god's reign on Azeroth lasted 113 days from his release, though not without a second wave of drama, and this would become a recurring event for Nihilum in their pursuit to gain world first. You see, one particular battle pet, the Disgusting Oozling, applied a buff to you when summoned, and back then both bosses and players had debuff and buff limits. Summoning and dismissing the pet in rapid succession would repeatedly apply a debuff to the player. 16 debuffs was enough to push off any negative debuffs that were applied during the Cthulhu fight, designed to make it more difficult. This was the first of many world firsts for Nihilum. Patch 1.11 saw the last 40-man raid ever in World of Warcraft, and an instance that was so difficult it's rumoured as little as 0.1% of the player base cleared it back in 2006. I'm of course talking about the floating necropolis, the Dread Citadel, Naxxramas, a gigantic 15-boss mega raid to end off World of Warcraft's debut on the MMORPG scene. This was a time when guilds couldn't save progress from last week. Every boss must be defeated in one reset, and though many looked to the end boss for the world first, the biggest and most challenging hurdle to overcome was the 4 Horsemen encounter, a fight that suddenly required your guild to have 8 tanks. 8 very geared tanks, might I add, and catch-up gear wasn't really a thing at the time either. Then beyond that lay the hardest resistance-based encounter ever, Sapphiron, but eventually it was Europe again that took the crown. Nihilum scored their second world first on the 7th of September 2006, securing their place as raiding legends. Vanilla though really was still the early days. During TBC and Wrath of the Lich King, organisations would start forming, sponsors would begin to get involved, and top guild names and players started to be talked about by the wider community. Esports and broadcasting became more commonplace, and players began to show their skills not only on YouTube, but on the likes of Justin TV, which would later become Twitch. This was a massive time of growth for World of Warcraft as a game, and along with it, guilds that have gone down in the history books of raiding rose and fell. Through the Dark Portal into World of Warcraft's first expansion would see no shortage of memorable raids and encounters for both the right and the wrong reasons. Near the entirety of the Burning Crusade would be marked as a period of dominance for the European guild that rose to prominence during vanilla Nihilum, and TBC would launch in 2007 with a huge amount of content for the competitive player: Gruul's Lair, Magtheridon's Lair, Serpent Shrine Cavern, Tempest Keep, Karazhan, and technically Mount Hyjal, all of which were of course behind the walls of attunements. By this point, raiding had been cut down from 40 to 25 players, distilling guilds down to only the best of the best. Gruul, a boss that would make a reappearance in a later expansion, will live for 19 days total, and Magtheridon for 40 days from expansion launch. Both kills were again claimed by Nihilum. Tier 5 though was about to be a rude awakening for even the best guilds. The two end bosses, Lady Vash and Kael'thas, were not just only a little bit harder than anything in TBC, they were massively harder, and yet it was Nihilum that once again claimed both world firsts. Or was it? To this day, they are accredited with the world first on Lady Vash. However, they managed to achieve this task an entire month ahead of the next guild that got world second, a guild that we'll certainly talk about a lot as well, Method. It's normal once one guild fells an end boss for kills to gradually start rolling in the days or at latest the weeks to follow. This potential case of exploit early, exploit often had given the world's best guild a taste of victory, though possibly not through dev intended means. An article from 2007 sheds a little light on the subject, saying that the boss did not reset correctly when a paladin used divine intervention and they were able to finish it off. Few screenshots and no video footage remain that I can find of their kill, and when Method finally landed their first clear over 1 month later, miles ahead of any other guild, they claimed it world first legit. As for Kael'thas, he wasn't beaten until after patch 2.1, the Black Temple nerf patch for tier 5, nor was Vash for the vast majority of guilds. I think at some point Blizzard realized that the attunement chain they had set up required guilds to defeat the end bosses of tier 5 to progress, and seeing as how practically nobody had done that, that was going to be a bit of a problem moving into tier 6. Speaking of tier 6, Nihilum continued their path of dominance, setting foot in Hyjal and claiming the world first kill on Rage Winterchill. You must do this in order to enter Black Temple, and then going straight into that raid and landing each and every single world first kill on the entire raid. Illidan lived for a total of 21 days. And then after that, Nihilum went straight back to Hyjal and 4 days later claimed the world first for Archimonde. No questions remained. This was the greatest raiding guild of its era. Their run of performance seemed totally unconquerable. Also, it's worth a note that Black Temple was the first time ever for raiding where Blizzard decided to hold a PTR, something which top guilds very much took advantage of to get an edge over the competition. But TBC wasn't over yet. Sure, they had beaten the big bad guy on the cover of the box, but the next expansion still wasn't for over 1 year. Surely there had to be some more raid content to tie the top guilds over. Indeed there was. On 25th of March 2008, patch 2.4 and the Sunwell Plateau became available, along with a feature which is often forgot about. Not all of the raid bosses were available on day 1. In fact, the latter half of the bosses were staggered week upon week, so top guilds were essentially stuck progress-wise even if they had the capability to clear the bosses. What the Sunwell is famously remembered for though is the Muru encounter, a room with a Naru who summons a lot of adds, and they have a lot of health and they do a lot of damage. If you fall behind on the adds, you wipe very fast. It was Muru that can be seen as the turning point for requiring min-max out of your raid comp, with drums of battle famously being stacked here to squeeze out every ounce of performance from your character. But for a change here in the race, and a wholly unexpected one, it would not be Nihilum to take the world first kill of Muru, or the final boss of the raid kill Jaden. It was a roster formed as part of an esport team, the German-founded SK Gaming. Not a newcomer to Blizzard games by any stretch of the imagination, SK Gaming had a track record for producing winners in the Warcraft 3 scene, and were now trying their hand in Blizzard's MMO, producing teams for both arena and raiding content. Whilst the established guilds in the scene for WoW were known to be great, they were exactly that, guilds. SK Gaming showed for the first time the power of the organization over the guild, sweeping the top guild in the world and taking a surprise clear on the hardest content Blizzard had ever released. Kil'jaeden lived for 62 days total, though you may be interested to know he was only actually available for attempts for 4 days due to bosses being staggered. Nevertheless, he was banished back to the Nether, and Azeroth was safe once again. However, the Sunwell would mark the end for both Nihilum and SK Gaming. It was a hard, grueling raid. Motivation ebbed among Nihilum, who had been pushing hard for the past 3 or 4 years, whilst SK Gaming didn't see a future in World of Warcraft PvE content as an esport, and moved back over to focusing in PvP. This led to a merger between the two raiding titans, combining the absolute best of the best, briefly known as 25th November, but later renaming to Insidia. Into the frozen land of Northrend, stakes were higher than ever. This was the peak of World of Warcraft subcount, and during this expansion, difficulty would spike considerably between achievements, hard mode, and finally heroic mode. This would separate the good from the great guilds. The mega merger of Insidia set out to do the business they'd been formed to do, getting all 15 world first kills in the Naxxramas remake 2 days after release, the world first of Malagos on the same day, and Sartharian 3 Drakes less than a week later, a statement opening tier. Ulduar in patch 3.1 dropped on the 14th of April 2009, giving us the only ever tier to have hard modes as the difficulty modifier. Ulduar featured 2 main challenges instead of your standard just go and kill all the bosses. Number 1 was defeating Algalon the Observer. This was a hard mode only boss that required you to have defeated all other encounters that had a hard mode and would despawn after 1 hour of combat. Number 2 was Yogg Zero Lights. This was defeating Yogg-Saron without any help from the Titan Keepers. This modification made the fight significantly harder. The race to Algalon was won by Insidia. He lived for a total of 50 days, though there is no shortage of accusations made amongst top guilds as to pretty much anything that could have in any way given another guild an advantage. Indeed, at the time some felt that Insidia, due to their legacy among raiding, were overlooked by Blizzard when taking advantage of actions which could very easily be considered exploits. One of many they took advantage of was their Hodia hard mode kill, where a number of mobs were dragged over from the Freya encounter that mages used to spell steal a buff called Flower Power from. This increased their damage by 25% and stacked up to 10 times. This meant the 5 mages they brought along were doing 250% bonus damage, and they could cheese the hard mode on the encounter. But hey, that was what you had to do at the time. Other guilds could have figured it out, so they have to if they want the world first, right? This is the mentality that prevailed at the time. Yogg Zero Lights was also not without drama. A guild, Exodus, found a way to bug out the final phase of the fight so that the ads that spawned had no effect. They said, the bug is when somebody is left inside the brain room of Yogg-Saron, they can still get aggro on the ads that spawn in phase 3. This means if you have somebody getting healing aggro in the brain room, they will get aggro on the ads, which cause them to evade in place and allows for all of your raid's DPS to be focused on Yogg. Nevertheless, they pushed on and even recorded the kill, afterwards reporting the severe bug that they had found. So what did Blizzard do other than ban them for 72 hours, remove the world first credit, titles, and loot? One member, K Warrior from Exodus, confirmed the suspension following the exploit, but also asked for a bit more accountability from Blizzard towards Insidia and their not too shiny track record. It would not take long for this to come true. As for Zero Lights, Insidia could not crack it with their roster, and a complete surprise came from a Taiwanese guild, Stars. The difference maker was the comp that they had access to. Part of the Zero Lights encounter has a mechanic where you cannot face the boss. Warlock's Drained Soul at the time was an extremely powerful execute ability that could be channeled with your back to the boss, which made them invaluable on the most important part of the fight. Yogg Zero Lights took 85 days to vanquish. Patch 3.2 led us onto one of World of Warcraft's less memorable raids, Trial of the Grand Crusader, the first tier to feature heroic raiding as a toggle outside of the instance, and the second tier in a row for an upset for the world first race. Insidia at the time claimed they were going for achievements rather than the actual first heroic kill. Regardless, another European guild rose here to prominence and began their era of dominance. Paragon, an entirely Finnish-speaking guild who pulled off some of the most impressive world firsts we have ever seen. With the grand finale of Wrath of the Lich King looming, it was looking like a two-horse race between the recently deposed Insidia and Paragon. But the opening of Icecrown Citadel would see one of the biggest dramas in competitive raiding ever, and the end of an era for a legend. Exodus's foreshadowing of Blizzard holding Insidia accountable had come around, and their time of reckoning was upon them. At the time, a clear on normal mode was required to access heroic, so guilds were looking to get the content clear as soon as possible. The race was truly on, and it was Insidia's world first Lich King 25 normal that led to their downfall. One exploit too far. This boss was just too big to Blizzard, and they could not ignore what had been done. The cause? Bombs. Saronite bombs. They somehow rebuilt the platform when they detonated. In a statement, Blizzard said the siege damage of the bombs was causing the Frozen Throne platform to rebuild, which greatly decreases the difficulty of the encounter. And in the hours to follow, Blizzard would issue both a hotfix to the encounter as well as a 72-hour suspension for members of Insidia. Opinions on this ban have gone back and forth so much. From rogues use bombs as part of their rotation, they didn't intend it, to it's about time Insidia were banned for using an exploit. Nevertheless, it was a full house of Finns that led their way to the world first Lich King heroic 25 kill. On 26th of March 2010, 46 days after heroic mode was made available, Arthas fell with arguably one of the most famous moments in WoW raiding history. In December of 2010, the Cataclysm struck, changing Azeroth forever and uncovering new zones that had been shrouded in mystery for so long. Hyjal, Uldum, and Vashir. And with this, raiding changed once again. Now 10 and 25 man had equal rewards, though 25 man got more drops. Also, the attempt system of previous tiers had gone. World first, raiders didn't know at the time, but the opening tier was going to be absolutely brutal. Tier 11 featured Blackwing Descent with a return from both Onyxia and Nefarian, Bastion of Twilight with Cho'Gall and the secret hidden heroic boss Sinestra, and Throne of the Four Winds, where we fought our first elemental lord of the expansion. The White Death, known as Paragon, washed over this entire tier, though Method were very much on their heels for the majority of it. Paragon opened Cataclysm with a trio of world firsts, Nefarian falling in 27 days, Bastion of Twilight in 38 days, and Al-Akir in 42 days. In the words of a Paragon raider Zin, all in all, this tier of raiding in my opinion has been the hardest tier of raiding overall. There haven't been many pushover bosses on heroic difficulty, there hasn't been any time gating, there hasn't been any achievements and such. It's just been one big, absolutely brutal grind. Secret boss Sinestra was nearly a source of drama as it hadn't been fully tested, and Blizzard were live hotfixing it during attempts, which made strategizing against it frustrating. And this wouldn't be the last time a boss was A, not tested, and then B, basically live tested by the world first raiders. Din also commented that you could literally hit the boss for over 1 billion damage with a single GCD. It was pretty scary watching Sinestra almost die by accident. Luckily it didn't come to this, and they claimed a kill as Blizzard intended in the end. The first major content patch for the Cataclysm dropped on June 28th. A summer release for the Firelands was all too fitting. This raid would see some very cool encounter design from the likes of Alis Resort, and our second encounter with the Elemental Lord of Fire, Ragnaros, except this time he's grown some legs. Paragon got an esports sponsor as well, now changing their name to Dream Paragon, and they would prove their worth in the Firelands. The revisit from Rag made many of the legendary boss lists of World of Warcraft look like absolute jokes. This fight was 16 minutes of absolute perfection, yet once again the Finns conquered the flame. Despite the sheer difficulty and having done over 500 pulls, Ragnaros Revisited fell 14 days from release. The follow-up raid to the Firelands is steeped in controversy among World of Warcraft fans. The birth of LFR, a tier that lasted 10 months with no new content, and a disappointing conclusion to the expansion. It also subverted the expectations of the players following the World First race, but not in the ways that you would want. With LFR being a brand new system, I suppose it shouldn't have been a surprise that it did have its problems, but it was LFR abuse that caused many top guilds to land themselves with an 8-day ban on the eve of heroic mode releasing, effectively giving themselves a little to no chance to compete. Both Method and Paragon were slapped with the ban hammer for exploiting here. Here's an explanation of what exactly went down from Paragon. We found out that you can loot past loot on bosses regardless of save status if you zone out and back into the instance. This did not provide the raid with any extra loot, but it did eliminate a major portion of the RNG that would have been involved in simply doing personal runs for everybody. And despite it being LFR gear, the Dragon Soul Tank Tier 4 set had exceptionally powerful bonuses that could function as raid-wide cooldowns. These, among other items, were very desirable for heroic progression as tools for the top guilds. However, kin raiders from Korea stepped up and claimed the world first kill on the Spine of Deathwing, and would go on to defeat the madness of Deathwing 2. In fact, many players at the time believed Spine to be the more difficult fight due to the extremely high burst DPS requirements. Deathwing lived for 14 days. The next expansion was considered a bit of an out-of-season April Fool's joke by many, yet contained some of the most loved raids and encounters. Our next journey takes us to a faraway land, where we're going to be fighting bugs, statues, most scarily of all, emotions. Paragon took a raid downsize, moving into Mists of Pandaria, and whilst they completely dominated the 10-man heroic scene, as mentioned at the start, the focus here is on 25. At the time, some of their raiders seeking to push looked to another EU guild that had steadily been on the rise, without question the most recognisable guild name ever, and a team that is still going today, Method. North American guild Blood Legion also proved highly competent during the era of Mists of Pandaria as well. The opening tiers of MOP had a staggered release. Mogashan Vaults was first, with Will of the Emperors dropping 3 days after it was out. Method claimed that one. Heart of Fear was next, another short race, Blood Legion taking a point for NA here. Empress Shekzia dropped on day 5. Terrace of the Endless Springs was the last for the opening tier, the final boss of the raid being the Shah of Fear. Despite it being one of the longest and most complicated boss encounters in recent memory, their first kill being a grueling 24-minute slugfest. Patch 5.1 opened on March 5th, 2013, the Throne of Thunder, a raid that players look back to as a crowning jewel on how damn good raiding can be when it's good. As with previous tiers, North American guild Blood Legion provided a competitor for Method. The boys from across the pond were starting to show signs of life after a stint of EU dominance in the raiding scene ever since AQ40. Nevertheless, Method at this point were really on a different level, going from strength to strength, earning their world first kill of Lei Shen heroic 25-man. This also unlocked the second secret-only heroic boss since Sinestra, the enslaved titan from whom Lei Shen had stolen his power, Raden. Unfortunately, just like Sinestra, the fight was buggy and it was undertuned, leading to a somewhat forgettable end of an otherwise fantastic tier. The Thunder King's reign lasted 14 days. Mists of Pandaria culminated with the heroes of Azeroth joining forces to storm the gates of Orgrimmar and put an end to the tyrannical reign of Garrosh Hellscream, who totally did nothing wrong. Siege of Orgrimmar was a marathon of a raid featuring 14 bosses total, only one less than Naxxramas. Although the majority fell within the first 2 days, and similar to Throne of Thunder, Blood Legion were on the heels of Method and indeed led the race early on. But Method cracking some of the tougher encounters earlier, such as Siegecrafter Blackfuse, gave them the extra time they needed on Garrosh. A 15-minute highly complex encounter where a lone paladin landed the final blow in their bubble. Garrosh lived for 14 days. We're seeing a lot of 14 days, aren't we, actually, for the world first kills. Wondering why? Well, it's reset day for the instance, and these kills usually blast back through the reclear, and the extra gear helps them get over the line just barely. Siege of Orgrimmar was a raid I enjoyed a lot personally as well. The one criticism, well, it opened on the 10th of September 2013. The next expansion wouldn't drop until the 13th of November 2014. That's a long time. I really hope it's worth the wait. Through the dark portal again then, but this time in the past? I'm confused. Time traveling orcs or something. Back to a blast from the past in Warlords of Draenor, we would see an uncorrupted Outland and face a whole new series of challenges, more commonly known at the time as the second orc expansion in a row. It had a lot to live up to, and raiding wise, many would agree it did. Warlords of Draenor was the first expansion where the newly introduced 20-man mythic mode would be used from the start to the end, a format which has stuck to this day. The opening tier was High Maul, and for this raid, the Finns made their triumphant return to 20-man raiding. After a dominant show in the 10-man scene of Mr. Pandaria, Aragon were back to the big leagues. And as they tended to do, they tipped the scales and got the world first of Imperator Margok. Overall, though, the High Maul world first race was a short one. Imperator lived for 4 days. The next tier, a mere 2 months later, was Black Rock Foundry, a raid with some of the most brilliant and just plain fun boss designs to ever have been put in the game. Hans and Franz with their slammers and pop-tarts, Operator Thogar aka the train boss, and Blackhand with his multi-floor encounter. Black Rock Foundry would be the final tier for NA's hopeful Blood Legion, as they once again fell short on a world first, though Midwinter gave Method a run for their money. But again, it was Method that landed the first kill. Blackhand lived for a total of 10 days. And at this point, things were not overly looking good for Warlords of Draenor here. There was a doubt that Blizzard even had another raid to pull out of the bag. They did though, Hellfire Citadel. This would be one of the hardest raid tiers in a very long time, and it all came down to the last boss, though the raid was packed with big lore names in WoW that we finally got to fight, such as Kilrog Deadeye, Gorefiend, Manaroth, but all of them fell over in the space of a week or so. Our second encounter with Archimonde since TBC was going to be quite a bit harder. Revamped Archimonde was one of the most mechanically demanding fights in a long time, and he lived for 16 days total. Warlords of Draenor, whilst having the challenge for raiders, had been a low point for many other players. Hopes were high heading into the next expansion, and with a return from Illidan Stormrage, the Demon Hunter class, and DPS meters about to go into their millions, how could it ever go wrong? Legion would prove to be arguably the most hardcore expansion there has ever been in WoW for the world first raiders. Between the legendary RNG, split raiding, this would be the last expansion to have master looting, grinding your AP, and maintaining all of this on multiple characters, the burnout was fierce among the top end players. The first tier of the expansion was the Emerald Nightmare. Surely this was going to be, wait, it was really undertuned. Or maybe the players were overtuned. One way or another, this opening tier missed the mark for difficulty hard, and was cleared within 18 hours of launch by Russian guild Exorsus. You could say Xavius surrendered to madness. A mini raid was added to tie over before the next big tier, and it was much more difficult than anything we had seen in the Emerald Nightmare. This was the Trial of Valor, and for the first time in a long old while, a title was added for not having died during the raid, the Chosen, though it was tracked on an individual player basis, not for the entire raid as it had been during Wrath of the Lich King for the Undying and other similar achievements. Hellier would live for 3 days as Method claimed another world first. The following raid was the Nighthold, the seat of the Nightborn's power, the font of night, and just lots of night stuff really. This raid would prove a 3-horse race between Method Exhaustus, and Serenity. Now, Serenity had been formed sometime earlier with the goal of landing their own world first, and Legion wasn't the easiest expansion they could have set themselves that goal in. In the end, for the Nighthold, the Russians took their second world first of the expansion, showing the Emerald Nightmare was not just a stroke of luck. In the next 2 days, both Serenity and Method would also land their kills. This will be the last world first race for Serenity though, as a number of their members are left to join Method, and the chance of a world first in the future slipped away. Exhaustus took 11 days and 248 attempts to clear the Nighthold. The next tier would test the skill and patience of even the best guild. That was the Tomb of Sargeras. Now, throughout our world first journey, there have been many excessively difficult encounters. Heroic Rag, Mythic Archimonde, but what would await the best guilds in Tomb of Sargeras was something even beyond that. In fact, at the start of the tier, Tomb of Sargeras was looking as though it was going to fall over in no time at all. And then guilds started getting to Fallen Avatar, a 2-part fight where you decided when the boss would be phased based on its energy bar or its remaining health, followed by a phase 2 DPS race, where Method barely managed to get the kill before the next mechanic would have wiped out the raid. The final fight in the Tomb of Sargeras was a second encounter against Kil'jaeden, and this would prove just more than a little more difficult than what SK Gaming had to deal with in the Sunwell. This encounter was brutally difficult and had mechanics that certain race class combos literally could not live through. Shamans and priests were forced to race change to Goblin for the rocket boost ratio that could be used to overcome a series of knockbacks. This entire encounter was 15 minutes of perfection of dealing with soaks, overlaps, and flawless execution. And after 19 days and 654 wipes, Method were free from the spaceship prison and had beat the Tomb of Sargeras. The ending cinematic of this instance would set the scene for our next journey, to another planet, to the home of the Legion, Argus. The final raid of this epic expansion would see the heroes of Azeroth finally take the fight to the Legion and destroy the corrupted world soul that sustained them. Though it was another relatively short raid overall, 10 out of 11 bosses were defeated by the second day of the raid opening, and from near the start it was looking as though a 2-guild race between US hopeful Limit and Europe's Method. Yet in another display of skill, after 8 days and 320 wipes, Method once again won the race without drama. Legion had been hard on the top guilds, a lot of grind, very difficult end bosses, and lots of RNG on gearing. The next expansion though, whilst not loved by many, would see massive changes in the high-end raiding scene and a total redesign of how the race was to be followed worldwide. For the first time in literally the history of raiding, the curtain would be pulled aside. Viewers would get a real look into exactly what went into World First raiding, the tactics, the comp changes, the wiping, the progress, the hours they pulled, day over sometimes week at a time. Spearheaded by Method, who had decided to stream their entire World First progression, this would bring an entire new level of hype to the event. No longer was it speculations on forums, rumours, and eagerly refreshing Warcraft log pages to see if a kill had been landed. Now you got it in real time. Many guilds would go on to follow this example, and today World First raiding has entirely changed because of this initiative. Whilst guilds now get to actively watch other attempts and learn from their mistakes, it makes it a much more compelling event, not to mention a much more solid earner for the organisations as well, which can keep them going strong. The opening tier for Battle for Azeroth was Uldir, a Titan facility reminiscent of Ulduar, though not quite so fondly remembered or looked back upon. In the end, Method's method prevailed, another world first for them. G'huun fell on day 8, after 285 pulls. The battle for Dazar'alor would follow, an interesting raid format where Horde and Alliance would briefly play as the opposite faction to see the story of the raid through their eyes. Similar to Uldir though, Limit was once again proving stiff competition for Method, but the last boss, Jaina Proudmoore, would be the real challenge. A race that only lasted one reset but coming down to the wire, and despite Limit getting there first, Method were able to perfect the tactics and take down the encounter in 7 days and 346 wipes. And then we had the Crucible of Storms, another mini raid like the Trial of Valor. As it turned out, this would be one of the most difficult raids in a very long time, despite only having 2 bosses. And for a change, a different European guild, Pieces, would land the world first kill. Crucible of Storms in the end lasted 9 days and 700 pulls until Pieces took down Unat. The next raid featured a zone and a boss who could have held up an entire expansion, but this was to be it unfortunately. Nazjatar and Ashara's Eternal Palace. Another relatively straightforward raid until the end boss again, Queen Ashara herself. The televised nature of the raid lended itself to how incredibly close pulls were going back and forth between Limit and Method. Side by side they were getting ever closer to a kill percentage by percentage, but it was Method again that claimed the throne for themselves, defeating the Queen after 12 days and 359 pulls. The final raid of the rollercoaster of BFA saw another setting you could have arguably put a whole expansion on, Nihilo for the Waking City. And for the first time in 8 years, North America took a world first. The last one was Heart of Fear and Mr. Pandaria. Yes, that was 8 years before BFA. Feel old yet. Limit took an early lead in the race and never let it go. The old god N'Zoth was a disappointing conclusion to an expansion many players would rather forget. He lived 10 days and endured 270 wipes. But Method's loss of the world first tier wouldn't be the thing that would nearly have the organisation fall apart. Something much worse had now been allowed to fester for far too long. In June 2020, a tweet longer was sent out alleging sexual misconduct from a prominent member of Method's raiding core and stream team, Method Josh. It was later found that Method had ample evidence of the ongoings but overlooked their importance and failed to act upon them. During the time in which the scandal unfolded, Method lost nearly everything. Sponsors left them, raiders sought out other teams, streamers quit the org, and leadership at the once world first guild went quiet for a period of several months. From the outside, it looked as though this would be it for Method. In time though, they would restructure, reevaluate, and be able to rebuild what was a fragmented organisation, because the next expansion was quickly approaching. With Method in turmoil, Limit seemingly had no competition left, and a world-first run seemed assured for the North American powerhouse. Yet in the wake Method had left behind, another European guild had risen, Echo. This new squad was many of the ex-Method members who still sought to push performance in World of Warcraft raiding on a world-class level, and the opening raid of Shadowlands would be their proving grounds. In the end though, Limit would claim a back-to-back end-to-start of expansion win for North America, taking out Sire Denathrius on day 8 after 143 pulls. Echo would land a close second, and a reformed Method would land 5th. The second tier of Shadowlands was the Sanctum of Domination, where we finally actually get to fight Sylvanas Windrunner, which for such a big lore character ended up being a kinda, well, not the most epic encounter we could have envisioned, put it like that. However, here EU were back with a vengeance as Echo burst onto the world first scene, taking the world first on day 7 after 169 pulls. It had been a short-lived reign for NA, yet the race between the two was still very close. Patch 9.2 saw the final major content patch of the Shadowlands and the final tier we will cover in this video, the Sepulchre of the First Ones. This raid saw a return of tier sets to World of Warcraft and an insane difficulty wall for the top end guilds, with many being stuck on a mid-raid boss for several days. Much like the past 2 tiers, it had appeared to be a race between North America hopeful Limit, who have now joined an org and changed their name to Liquid, and Europe's Echo. And as we've seen so far, it takes something special for an end boss to make it past day 14, and the Jailer would be one to join that group. Echo once again proved their worth on a back-to-back world first victory, felling Zoval on day 18 after 227 pulls. That's the same number of days as Archimonde Mythic was in Warlords of Draenor and 1 less than Mythic Kil'jaeden in Legion. Suffice to say, this was not a pushover tier. Equally remarkable was Method scoring World 2nd after Limit called it due to burnout among players. At the same time, somewhat of a bittersweet climb for Method, as the Jailer bugged in the final phase and did not heal as much as he was supposed to. Nevertheless, the kill stands and Blizzard have just hotfixed it moving forwards. To be in contention for World 2nd all the same considering what happens shows the organisation that still has a lot of talent. Which brings us all the way up to date. We don't even know what the next expansion is as of this video releasing. All we do know is it's going to be announced April 19th. You can really tell how the World First race has changed over the years and how much more competitive the scene has grown. The tuning for content Blizzard is throwing at the best raiders in modern World of Warcraft is crazy difficult, and I think you can see a turning point when Paragon began to demolish the competition back in Wrath of the Lich King to early Cataclysm, where even exceptionally difficult bosses were barely making it to the second reset. We will have to see whether Blizzard considers the difficulty of the Sepulchre of the first one as a new benchmark, or whether it's just the last raid of the expansion. Let's give people something to bash their heads against for a good while. I can only imagine how many times the content will be nerfed to be actually reasonable for the average cutting edge guild, or maybe the extra tier in legendaries will do the job instead. The race to World First is truly one of the most epic events on the World of Warcraft calendar, a combination of both a marathon and a sprint from the best guilds in the world to see who can be the first to defeat all of the new bosses from the new raid tier. At least, that's what we usually hope that it will be. As you may have recently seen, Liquid's World First defeat of Gallywix in the Liberation of Undermine raid came seemingly out of the blue, with a 100 pull count on what otherwise was sizing up to be a competitive race. Not to take anything away from them, of course, it's a deserved win and it's not their fault the boss fell somewhat short on expectations of what we all know Blizzard is capable of doing. But it got me thinking back to some of the previous Race to World Firsts, whether they were streamed or otherwise. Which ones were some of the most difficult for the best players to overcome? What would be the top 10 hardest end bosses of the Race to World First from their poll count? Well, that is what I want to answer today. So I'm only going to be including bosses where there is some recording of the poll count attempted, which I can find and verify. Of course, this is really easy post-battle for Azeroth because everything's been streamed, but in the earlier days of WoW, back when the Race to World First was much more secretive, there wasn't always a clear number of pulls recorded by those pushing the boss. All they would have cared about was getting the World First in the first place, never mind the pull count. But I'll try and include some honourable mentions towards the end of bosses that you might have expected to see, but either their pull count was lower than you would have thought, or were just not really 100% sure. So with all that said, let's make a start on this. And we'll be beginning at number 10 in Legion with Method's World First defeat of Mythic Argus the Unmaker in the raid Antorus the Burning Throne, which took a total of 320 pulls to complete over an 8-day duration. Legion was an expansion of extremes. Whilst it had the easiest Mythic raid boss ever in Xavius in its first raid tier, the Emerald Nightmare, it also packed some extremely challenging encounters over its whole duration. And this isn't the last time we're going to be hearing about Legion in this video, believe me. Argus the Unmaker was the final fight of the expansion though, closing a chapter in the World of Warcraft universe that saw a huge return to form for the whole IP. Method at this point in time were very much in their stride and have been claiming many world firsts for quite a while, so they came into this tier as being the favourite to claim another win. That being said, Antorus the Burning Throne as a raid was definitely a step down in difficulty from its predecessor, and once Mythic Week opened up, all but the final boss were defeated in the space of 2 days, leading to a final head-to-head battle on Argus between EU's Method and North American contender Limit. For an end boss during this Warlords of Draenor to BFA timeframe, Argus was more on the tame side, even though it was clearly anything but a pushover, featuring plenty of raid coordination needed, and that one transition phase where the boss just goes all main character and one-shots the raid Lich King style. But unlike Lich King, after you resurrect, you've still got a lot of work ahead of you. And of course, Downy Argus at all had the chance to reward the legendary trinket to end all legendaries, Amanthal's Vision, which just gave an incredible amount of stats, and as far as I remember was BIS for just about everyone. Even though Blizzard made it super rare and hard to get, you were lucky if you had this, believe me. Next we're heading back one expansion to Warlords of Draenor, a rather short but also sweet addition to World of Warcraft Warcraft when it came to raiding, and for all the negatives people can have against Warlords of Draenor as a whole, people tend to agree it did one thing well, and that was raiding. At number 9 it's Mythic Blackhand in the Blackrock Foundry, with Method also claiming this world first with 325 pulls over a 10-day duration. Warlords of Draenor was the first expansion to fully embrace this brand new Mythic raiding mode for all of its content. This new 20-player format was designed for the best players in the world, and it would certainly put them to the test in WoD. Blackrock Foundry was the second raid tier to drop in WoD, featuring some of the most memorable bosses ever, such as Hans and Franz, Operator Thogar, aka the Train Boss, and the marathon of an encounter that was Mythic Blast Furnace. But awaiting the best raiders at the end of this instance was a Warlord of Draenor, Blackhand, and this fight was no slouch on difficulty. As the fight progressed, you would gradually drop down to each new platform, first just fighting Blackhand himself at the very top as debris fell from the ceiling, and then he smashes the platform down one layer and you had to contend with adds upon the rafters, as well as dealing with a host of various war machines while still managing to keep up with the boss's own mechanics. Down one more floor and you take on the final part of this encounter, where the boss would gradually fill the room with dangerous AoE zones. Players had to manage soaking falling debris and managing tight positioning requirements here. It was a true race to the finish, and the first kill by Method just barely scraped by a few moments before wiping. Definitely a worthy fight of the name Blackhand, and a visually impressive one too. Next we're heading forwards quite a few expansions to one of the most modern additions to this list, and that would be Mythic Fyrakk the Blazing and Emir Drasil the Dream's Hope during Dragonflight. The world first of this was claimed by Europe's Echo with 344 pulls over a 12-day duration. The funny thing here is the penultimate boss, Tindral Sageswift, actually eclipsed this pull count and took 435 attempts. There are very few instances of this happening. In fact, Tindral himself will be ranked higher than quite a few end bosses that we still have to talk about. The race on Fyrakk himself was perhaps one of the best showings of how good the race to world first can be, with Echo and Liquid literally battling head to head on single-digit percentage pulls back to back. The encounter itself had all the hallmarks of a difficult WoW boss too. Tons of telegraphs to dodge, strict positioning, baiting requirements for certain abilities, and a dreaded extra action button mechanic for certain players. It had multiple DPS check breakpoints, and it all ended with a race to the finish where Echo were barely able to defeat the boss a matter of seconds before wiping. I really hope to see more race to world first events that can put on a show like this raid tier did, and we can only hope the next one is as good. Now we head back once again all the way to Battle for Azeroth. BFA was the real start of the race to world first as we know it today, where it's a massive event and everything is streamed the whole way through, with Method at the time taking the step to stream its opening raid, Uldir. Before that, everything was a lot more secretive because, of course, race to world first guilds wanted to hide information as much as possible from their competitors. But nowadays we get to watch along and see the progression, and I'm glad this transition happened. Anyways, at the 7th spot is Mythic Lady Jaina Proudmoore in the Battle for Dazar'alor raid. This race to world first was once again won by Method, who took a grueling 347 pulls to clear this boss over a 7-day duration. Battle for Dazar'alor was a unique raid where players would be race changed on different fights to fit in theme with the story of the raid. We'd spend the first half of the raid as Alliance storming Dazar'alor, and then the second half as Horde fighting the Alliance forces. Imagine if it was the other way around and race to world first guilds didn't have the usual Horde racials for the final few most difficult bosses. And yes, the Horde racials were still better for PvE back then. Berserking, for trolls especially, is kinda good. But Jaina herself was an epic multi-phase encounter against a master of frost magic. Starting off on the ship, you had to contend with various position-based mechanics and bombs before you dropped Jaina's health enough, and then the real fight began. You got a short cutscene and she teleported to the center of a frozen sea battlefield where players must weather the storm and find her to interrupt her cast. Throughout the fight, players had to manage their heat level too, have it drop too low or get hit by certain mechanics, and you turn into a giant ice block which other players would have to break you out of, and you really didn't have the damage to spare for mistakes like this. Midway through the phase, you get teleported back to the entrance again and have to locate the boss within the ice field again, whilst now dealing with a giant water elemental portal and mirror images that copied her spells, but overall you just wanted to nuke the boss as much as you could. As with some previous encounters, this was another race to the finish moments before wiping, and it was definitely a memorable addition to the race to world first. For number 6, we're staying in battle for Azeroth, and with method too. The next boss here is Mythic Queen Ashara in the Eternal Palace raid. She took method 359 attempts over a 12-day duration to clear, though all the bosses apart from Ashara were cleared in 4 days from release, so she was really the big challenge. Similar to Amir Drasil, this tier also delivered an amazing race to world first to watch, with another head-to-head battle on the final fight, with method versus limit once again, and each of them edging closer and closer to finally scoring a kill. The fight itself was divided up into several parts, and you had a lot of things to manage before you were even really able to engage the queen herself. From the pair of ads at the start of the fight, to managing the wards around the encounter to ensure their energy didn't reach zero, and on mythic mode there would be a giant beam that would split the whole raid in two periodically as well. This fight also had what I can only really describe as being a weak aura mechanic, because I have no idea how you would be able to react fast enough without the help of an add-on. Players would get a command to perform a certain action, such as soak an orb, group up, keep moving, stand still, stand alone, or don't soak an orb, and on heroic mode and above you had to perform 2 of these actions at the same time. So basically your entire raid got 2 of these commands and has mere seconds to figure out where they should be, who they should stack with or not stack with, and what they should be doing, or you're going to begin taking massive damage. In a world without add-ons, you have to imagine this would have caused countless wipes, but in a world with one, there was a big message on your screen telling you what to do. In the final part of the fight, the room starts to fill up with void zones, and it's a race to the finish to see if you could defeat Ashara before you run out of space or just lose too many people. Ashara was one of the most complicated fights we've seen in a very long time, and definitely one of the more challenging end bosses in recent memory. Next, we're heading all the way forwards into our current World of Warcraft expansion, The War Within. And where the liberation of Undermine fell somewhat short on expectations, the same cannot be said for the first raid of this expansion, Nerubar Palace. Here, North America's Liquid, who were formerly Limit, claimed the world first kill on Queen Anshrak in 404 pulls over a 12-day duration. Nerubar Palace had quite a interesting difficulty curve as well, with a few freebies at the start of the raid, as is often custom with Mythic difficulty, before things really started to ramp up in difficulty on the 5th boss, Brood Twister of Inax, and beyond. Ansarak was a mechanically challenging multi-phase encounter consisting of severe DPS checks, positioning requirements, and even had a mechanic where a player had to run to the center of a circle, which would knock up all nearby players and allow them to avoid a Venom Nova effect, which would otherwise one-shot them. What made this difficult was how punishing just about all of the mechanics were when they went a bit wrong. If you barely missed a DPS check, you were gonna wipe. If you messed up knocking up too early or late, you were gonna wipe. Even if you didn't time your personal defensive cooldowns correctly, it could come back to bite you later on. Ultimately, this was another close race between Echo and Liquid, but Liquid really pulled through on this tier and were able to claim this world first. At the 4th spot, we journey back again to Warlords of Draenor. For an expansion that had 3 raid tiers in total, it was not short on difficult bosses, and in Hellfire Citadel, the player's second encounter versus Archimonde would prove just a bit more challenging than how he had been in Mount Hyjal during TBC. Here it took Method a total of 473 pulls to defeat Mythic Archimonde over a 16-day duration. Well, if Ashara ever felt like a bit of a weak aura check, this boss felt as though it was the origin of that trend in Mythic raiding. Whilst in its own right, Archimonde Mythic was both a lengthy and complicated fight, it featured some mechanics which were just completely unreasonable difficulty-wise to figure out in the amount of time you were given. Perhaps one of the most infamous boss mechanics ever in World of Warcraft Mythic raiding is Wrought and Focus Chaos. Players in the raid are each given a debuff, one of them's named Wrought Chaos and the other's Focus Chaos. After 5 seconds go by, these 2 pairs of players with a debuff will fire a beam between one another. If any pair of players overlapped a beam so they got hit by 2 separate ones, they're pretty much going to get one shot. Also, this mechanic picked 3 different sets of players each time it happened, so your entire raid has 5 seconds to figure out 3 times in a row that no 2 beams were going to hit the same player. Yeah, good luck with that, by the way. Radial add-ons were developed that would read where these beams were going, so you could easily look and just know whether or not you were safe, and these add-ons or weak auras were very much essential to ensure ensuring that you don't stay forever wiping in this phase of the fight. Apart from Paragon, of course, who figured out a consistent way to do this mechanic with no custom add-on, but that's just Paragon doing Paragon things. In fact, following the Archimon fight, Blizzard removed the ability for players to retrieve this data from the API and essentially made this kind of add-on not work anymore. I mean, it's their fault for creating a mechanic that was this difficult to deal with, but there we go. Mythic Archimon also had a unique Mythic only phase where he would drag all players down into the Nether for the final part of the fight, which brought on plenty of positioning based mechanics and a DPS race to the end before you ran out of room. As weeks went on in Hellfire Citadel, the raid did start to get easier and easier because, as you may recall, the legendary rings were just incredibly overpowered. Also, some of the trinkets in there were especially insane. Either way, it was a hard fought battle for Method, and they claimed this world first. We are now entering top 3 territory. 3 end bosses remain where there is some recording of the pull count that they had to undergo. At the 3rd spot is Heroic Ragnaros from Cataclysm. This world first was claimed by Paragon, who took a somewhat ambiguous 500 plus pulls to clear this boss in a 14-day time frame. Much like Archimon, this was our 2nd encounter with Ragnaros since the good old days of vanilla, and much like Archimon, he was going to be a bit more challenging. Of course, Cataclysm Classic has now given us the chance to re-experience this fight in all its glory, but what we've had nowadays would have been a far cry from what Paragon had to undergo to get the first kill all those years ago. I can only imagine what their comms sounded like when he just straight up grew legs and got up out of his lava pit. It must be the most iconic heroic Oni phase this game has ever seen. Ragnaros 25 Heroic is a long boss fight though, and a relentless one at that from start to end. Initially it's about clearing up lava traps so they don't block your play space for later, and ensuring that your raid is spread enough to not overlap any large mechanics. Then of course you have the transition phases where Sons of Flame rush back towards Sulfuras that Ragnaros has planted somewhere in the room, and if any of them reach it, you instantly wipe. It's kind of funny, this submerge phase was a throwback to the original Ragnaros encounter in vanilla, but oftentimes, at least in Classic, people would just outright kill the boss before he ever got the chance to use this ability. Later still in the fight is dodging lava seeds and clearing up all the adds before they reach your player, and they'll probably one-shot them if they do, before you push towards the heroic only mode phase, which in theory is pretty simple. There's people on fire cleaning duty, the tanks managing when the boss should be walked into the roots, and of course people kiting the living meteors and deciding when they should be brought into the frost patches so that they can be killed. It's just reaching this point would have taken well over 10 minutes of re-progressing the entire fight and playing very well, and if any small thing goes wrong, it can snowball into a wipe very easily. Ragnaros Heroic is definitely one of the most iconic encounters in World of Warcraft history, and over 500 pulls to get him down shows how difficult this fight truly was and how dedicated Paragon were. At the number 2 spot, we're venturing onto a boss for its difficulty is borderlining on insanity. Once again, it was another return from a boss that had already been fought during World of Warcraft, with his first appearance being the final boss in the Sunwell raid during the Burning Crusade. And once again, his second appearance was going to be a bit more challenging. This is of course Kil'jaeden Mythic in the Tomb of Sargeras from the Legion expansion, a boss that took Method 654 attempts to clear over a 19-day duration. The Tomb of Sargeras was a raid with an absolutely absurd difficulty curve. It had plenty of free bosses towards the start, and then you got towards the end and things just went wild. In fact, Tomb of Sargeras has the highest collective pull count between all bosses of any race to world first ever, with around an estimated 1,250 pulls to clear the entire raid. Another fun fact is that the penultimate fight of this raid, Fallen Avatar, had already taken Method 454 pulls, so you better believe they were going to be feeling the burn before they even got to Kil'jaeden. But then of course they got to Kil'jaeden, and where do you even start with this fight? I think the key phrase for Kil'jaeden is overlapping mechanics, each of which are pretty simple in their own right, but then they start to cross over one another and things begin to get extremely complicated, and honestly at one point were borderline not possible. Method was 6 days deep progressing on this fight before Blizzard actually had to step in and nerf him, changing mechanics, timings, and tuning down his damage on certain abilities. But this was still far from an easy encounter. Overlaps included needing to soak Armageddon circles that would one-shot the raid if you missed one. You could also be getting knocked back during this happening, splitting damage from a blast targeted on one player whilst moving out with a huge AoE zone, and so much more. To talk a bit more about these knockbacks, there were orbs called Rupturing Singularities that would spawn at the edge of the room. On lower difficulties, these knocked you back a little bit. On Mythic, they straight up knocked you from one side of the platform to the other, and you had to be pretty much underneath it in order to survive. In fact, this knockback was so difficult to deal with for classes that lacked mobility that to counter it, some classes, such as Priests, had to reroll Goblin for their rocket boot racial, which enabled them to hop forward a short distance after getting knocked back. But wait, there's more. There's an intermission where you have to find Illidan somewhere in the darkness to grant you sight. After he's given you sight, you need to gather ads up and AoE them down very fast before they overwhelm you. Oh, by the way, during this complete darkness, the knockbacks are also happening, and you just need to know when they're going to occur so you can counter them with a movement ability. And the final major phase saw pillars spawn, which fired beams between them, and you had to locate a safe spot. And there was also an orb that had to be kited to the side of the room, whilst there was constant ramping raid-wide damage on top of that. This fight, in my opinion, was the most difficult WoW encounter that we've ever seen, even though it's not quite at the top of the list, and that remains true even in its post-nerf state. Kil'jaeden Mythic had absolutely everything. It had DPS checks, overlapping difficult mechanics, positioning requirements, target priority, personal responsibility, needing to perform mechanics non-verbally due to time constraints, and so much more. I wish Method streamed the Race to World first back then, to be honest. This would have been a spectacle to behold with just how obscenely difficult it was. Nevertheless, there is one end boss remaining that took even more attempts than this to finally defeat. But first, as promised at the start, we have a few honourable mentions of notoriously hard bosses which you might have expected to see but are absent from this list. First up is Paragon's defeat of Lich King 25 Heroic, which they estimated around 170 pulls. There was still the attempt system back then where you could only wipe 50 times per reset between the 3 end of wing bosses, so this somewhat capped how much they could bash their head against this legendary fight. Still, this might be a lower number than you expected. Next honourable mention is Garrosh 25 Heroic, which was killed by Method. I found a post where Method member Nox claims that this boss took them around 272 attempts. Garrosh was a seriously long encounter, so this was probably more than enough for them at the time. Also, this fight famously ended up with just their paladin tank left standing, which is a truly epic moment. The final honourable mention is Yogg 0 World First by Guild Stars. Now, there are posts online floating about claiming 500 plus attempts to get this boss down, but there's nothing confirming that which I can find from any Stars member themselves. And they even did put out a detailed post after having defeated the boss, which was translated to English, and it just doesn't mention their pull count. As such, I really couldn't include it here, but at the number 1 spot, what is statistically the hardest WoW end boss ever via pull count is a boss from Battle for Azeroth. This was Mythic Unat in the Crucible of Storms that took European Guild pieces an astounding 731 attempts to finally get down over a 10-day duration. So whenever Unat is brought up, you do have a few extra bits to mention. First is that the Battle for Dazara lore progress took place about 3 months prior to this raid, and the Race to World First guilds can usually plan around major tiers a good while in advance. But this smaller 2-boss raid in the Crucible of Storms came out of the blue, and no one expected it to be anywhere near as difficult as it was. A limit who had been very much on Method's tail in the prior raid tier just decided not to race Crucible, so that was one serious contender out, and the Mythic Dungeon International was also happening, so plenty of top-end players were already tied up competing in that. Nevertheless, Pieces were a top-performing guild in their own right, being top 5 in the Race to World First in all tiers of BFA except Eternal Palace. And if you look back through this video, you'll realise that BFA was not an easy raiding expansion. In fact, Method, whose kill came merely a few hours later than Pieces, took 751 attempts to get this monster of a boss down. So what was the deal with Unat then? Why was he so difficult? Well, for example, he brought back the infamous mechanic from Nighthold, which is often known simply as the Star Augur mechanic. This would give various people in the raid an icon over their their head, and they have several seconds to find a player with a matching icon, or they would explode and wipe the raid. And if you walked over somebody with a different icon, you'd also explode and wipe the raid. And the room got smaller as this fight progressed, so you had less and less room to deal with this raid-wide one-shot mechanic that could be caused by one person's error. You also had to manage certain relics throughout this fight, which would give players powerful bonuses, but these could also be misused and could even wipe the raid if used at the wrong time. Unat was also absurdly melee unfriendly. Pieces brought one demon hunter because they put a 5% magic damage debuff taken on the boss back in BFA. This was both because of the Star Auger mechanic I just mentioned, as well as one of the relics, the Tempest Caller, being needed to kill ads, and it was just much easier if no melee were in the way. You'll also notice all these elemental shamans they were stacking from their comp screenshot. Elemental was good in its own right then, of course, but they also had a rather unique interaction in this fight. So of course back then shamans had Ankh on a 30-minute cooldown, which would allow them to res themselves. However, this cooldown didn't reset after an encounter ended, but for Unat the tuning was so tight that for each of these pulls, pieces really needed those Ankhs available to make their tactic work. So they found what can be best described as a clever use of game mechanics to ensure this cooldown was up without having to wait some 30 minutes between each of their 700 plus pulls. They found the Morozond encounter over in the end time dungeon from Cataclysm has an hourglass that can be clicked during the fight, which resets all of your cooldowns. This for some reason included Ankh, so they did an attempt on the boss, failed. The shamans got summoned over to end time to reset their rank, get summoned back to the raid, and go again. It's crazy what a world first takes, right? Raids are one of the most defining factors of every single version of World of Warcraft that's ever existed. Whatever the expansion, there has to be some, usually world-ending threat that we, as adventurers, have to go and deal with. And ever since the dawn of WoW, raids have been a cornerstone of the end game, and something that players would gradually work towards. Many of these raids have contained bosses that people still talk about to this day, whether they progressed them originally, or maybe you got to revisit them on classic servers more recently. However, some raids and bosses didn't go down so well. It's inevitable when there are hundreds of bosses across dozens of raids, eventually there are going to be ones which really just aren't that great. And that's what we're talking about today, the worst designed raid bosses of all time. Whether it was due to frustrating mechanics, bugs, forcing players to wait constantly in between things happening, or anything else it could possibly be, there are plenty to choose from. But let's make a start on this and talk about 10 of the worst World of Warcraft raid bosses of all time. We're going to be starting in Wrath of the Lich King with an addition from Trial of the Grand Crusader. This raid was seen as really bad back in the day, but to be honest, having played it on Wrath Classic more recently, it was kind of fun. It felt nice having a short raid with good rewards after 6 months inside of Ulduar. The bosses in here were overall good as well, apart from one of them, which even back in the day was a very controversial fight, the Faction Champions. Often referred to as the PvP boss, this has players face off versus NPCs representing each of the 10 classes within the game, and it is a chaotic fight to say the least. I remember really liking this fight back in the day during Wrath because I was way more into PvP back then, and what I did in Battlegrounds translated well into this style of encounter. Instead of just perform your DPS rotation and don't stand in bad stuff, it was more about CC, kiting, burst, and interrupts. These were familiar things to me. However, revisiting this fight during Wrath Classic left me with a different impression, and definitely a more negative one. The thing is, it's a super front-loaded fight, and it's just a mess, to be honest. Everyone is just firing abilities back at one another, and it's super unclear what is exactly happening in the moment. Enemies could also just pick one singular player and decide they're going to pretty much global them, and that was very easy to have happen to the odd melee player. I've had faction champion fights where I just get chased by 3 or 4 enemies for 30 seconds straight, and all you can do is run and pray they decide to swap. And after about 1 minute of the fight has gone by, you've basically already won or lost the encounter. The remainder of it is just very slowly defeating the remaining enemies over about 2 to 3 minutes. All in all, for this encounter, it was just too front-loaded with how much was going on, and then it got really boring shortly after. So because of that, I don't think faction champions ended up being too good of a fight. Next up, I have an addition from the first raid tier in Battle for Azeroth, Mythic Fetid Devourer. This could be up to the third boss in the raid, depending on the order you went through it, but it was widely seen at the time as one of the more difficult encounters on Mythic. Uldir, of course, was also the first raid to be streamed live by the Race to World First guilds, and this boss in particular was one Blizzard had to hotfix mid-race because of how absolutely impossible the DPS requirements were. But even post-nerf for us regular mortals, or should I say first post-nerf, the fight was extremely challenging all the same, and above all, it was RNG heavy, and this was the problem. See, the fight had these two eggs, or ads I guess, we can call them either thing, and these spawned randomly throughout the room, and players had to kill them before they finished their cast. If they finished their cast, the boss would run over to them, eat them, heal a bunch of health, and you could no longer beat the enrage timer. On Mythic, there was an additional ad too, so you had to deal with 3 at once. The Mythic ad would always spawn towards the center of the room, so you always had a good idea where it would be, but the 2 regular ads could randomly spawn on opposite sides of the room, or just right next to one another. So depending on your luck with RNG on the ads, this fight could be really easy, or just literally impossible to hit the DPS check. Also, it was highly melee unfriendly due to the amount of movement that was needed, and the fact there was a debuff you could easily spread between players. The health on the ads was nerfed a further 2 times throughout Mythic progression to make this fight easier, but for many raids, and myself included here, if the boss decided to spawn ads across the room from one another, you just have to reset the boss, go again, and hope you got lucky next time. Overall, it was just such a frustrating boss to do. It was a difficult DPS check to hit, and the RNG made it unbearable. Next up, we're heading back to Wrath of the Lich King for another complete miss of a boss for me in Malagos in the Eye of Eternity. This is a single boss encounter, miles away from the rest of tier 7. I mean, you could use the wormhole generator to get there, but still, it was kind of out of the way. It's an epic idea for a boss though, the aspect of magic, but it felt like so much more could have been done with this character than this rather forgettable small raid. There was a cool boss arena too, with you floating inside of space, but the fight itself just wasn't very good. Malagos is the aspect of magic, one of the most powerful beings on Azeroth. What does he do in phase 1? He just kind of melees the tank a bit, occasionally does a breath. In phase 2, he calls in a bunch of dudes on flying discs while he just, I don't know, melees the tank a bit more. In phase 3, he finally destroys the platform, actually, you know, doing some magic. That's pretty cool. And then you all hop on red drakes and press 1 or 2 buttons till the boss dies. It just felt like such a missed opportunity for a boss encounter that could and should have been so much cooler. The fight was just not very fun, and when it felt like it was getting going, you were then forced onto vehicle combat to finish it out. And of course, we know Blizzard love their vehicle combat in Wrath of the Lich King. It was one of their big new features for the expansion, but even on the only decent vehicle combat encounter, which was Flame Leviathan, it was still just okay. Oh, and the hitbox on Malagos when you were trying to play a hunter being at range was absolutely rage-inducing as well. At least Malagos wasn't a difficult boss, you go in there and one-shot him no problem, but it wasn't exactly the highlight of the raiding week either. Next up, I have a boss from Cataclysm, and I didn't mind doing this boss so much back in the day, but having redone it a bunch of times now, yeah, I can confidently say I do not like this encounter at all. And I'm talking about the Conclave of Wind and the Throne of the Four Winds. In fact, this goes a bit above and beyond just this encounter in particular, and it's more, I'm not a huge fan of encounters where you have to split your raid up at the start, so think Spoils of Pandaria in MOP, Opulence in BFA, and so on. The problem with these fights is it just feels frustrating to wipe when you're doing everything right and something else keeps going wrong elsewhere. I guess this kind of happens on every single raid fight, people inevitably make mistakes, but there's something about not really knowing what's going wrong or being able to see it happening which just makes it feel even worse. It can just be a repeat of you go in, you do your job fine, but then a wipe is called, and it just gets really annoying multiple times in a row. When the raid is split, it feels as though mistakes happen much more frequently too. Your raid are going to have those players who can clutch heals in a moment, the tanks who can reposition enemies in advance when they see something happening, or DPS who are just way better at CC and interrupting. And when players are split up, sometimes those people aren't all on the same side anymore, and because of that, more mistakes start to happen. Anyways, for Conclave specifically, there are 3 bosses on 3 platforms. Each of them have to be engaged by players at all times or they're going to wipe the raid, and all 3 have to die together or they will full heal. You have to DPS 2 of the bosses before everyone heads to the back of the room to pop cooldown lands on the highest health boss as well. It's just about balancing your DPS out, ensuring that mechanics are happening at the correct time, and not pushing the boss's health too early. It's not necessarily a difficult fight, but it's just super easy to wipe on due to the balancing act of dealing with 3 bosses at once. Next up, I feel as though I'm going from one type of boss in split your raid in half bosses to another type of boss in wave defense bosses. So things such as Hellfire Assault, ENR, and, well, to be fair, the majority of the bosses in Mount Hyjal. If you wipe on the bosses, you have to do the trash waves again. Anyways, for this one, I'm picking the first boss inside of Hellfire Citadel, the Hellfire Assault. The idea here is that you're turning the weapons of the Iron Horde against them to blast open the gate and gain entry to the Citadel. Sounds pretty amazing in theory, not as cool in reality. Here really it's just about dealing with constant adds, picking up ammo, taking them to the cannons, firing the cannons, repeating, and if the adds kill a cannon, it's a wipe. The fight could go on for a while too, with constant waves of enemies spawning that had to be dealt with according to a priority list, and it was pretty easy to lose people on Mythic mode due to all the random damage going out, which could easily snowball the fight out of control. Overall, I think the biggest thing for wave control fights is they don't feel quite as satisfying as having some kind of central boss that you're dealing with. On top of that, Blizzard left this fight in a practically unsoloable state for years, so you were gate kept out of the rest of the raid due to being unable to protect the cannons from all the adds that spawned in, which is like adding insult to injury on this encounter. Next, we're heading all the way back to Vanilla. Now, to be honest, a lot of the bosses in Vanilla aren't exactly the most interesting encounters out there. People mean that mobs in Mythic Plus have more mechanics than your average classic raid boss, and, you know, sometimes they're right about that. Despite this, a ton of Vanilla bosses may not be the most interesting, but it was just a different time, and they're often fine for what they were. But there is one Vanilla encounter in particular which I know I'm not a huge fan of, and it's one of the optional bosses in AQ40, Viscidus. You know, back when AQ40 released in Classic again, Viscidus was the least killed boss within the raid. Way more people had done Cthulhu than this. You see, the boss has a unique mechanic to it in order to be defeated. First, enough frost-based attacks have to hit the boss to freeze it. There are some interesting ways to do this other than just be a mage and press Frostbolt. You can help out as a melee by going to farm weapons like the Cold Rage Dagger from Razorfen Downs, or go get yourself a Frost one such as Captain Rackmore's Tiller from that one quest in Desolus, where you have to farm keys with the terrible drop rates. Anyways, after you do enough frost attacks, the boss will freeze, and then you have to hit it with enough melee attacks to shatter it into small blobs. You can actually kill these blobs for real, and you have to defeat enough of them before the boss reforms at the center of the room. And if you fail to kill enough of them, the boss gets back up, and you start the whole freeze the boss process once again. Whilst you are freezing the boss too, it's spamming a poison bolt volley on the whole raid, which does a lot of damage. So really, you're just trying to do some kind of frost damage to the boss, or you're dispelling. Also, this is way easier to deal with on the Horde because Poison Cleansing Totem dispels your entire party every few seconds. It's kind of overpowered here. There is some intrigue here with a unique mechanic, but ultimately it's just not that fun to deal with. This fight can also go wrong really easily because of the ramping damage from Poison Bolt Volley and the risk of the boss reforming. And if you wipe, well, you never really want to do the run back when it comes to AQ40, do you? Next will be a trip to our current classic expansion in Mists of Pandaria for the end boss of the Terrace of Endless Spring, the Shah of Fear. There's something about Blizzard during this Cataclysm to Mists of Pandaria era of the game where they had an absolute obsession that end bosses should be extremely long fights. Think stuff like Ragnaros, Garrosh, or of course the king of bosses that go on for way too long, the Shah of Fear. Put it like this, Alayshan Heroic 25, the final boss from the next raid tier, okay, if we're not counting Raden that is, had 1.75 billion health total. Shah of Fear has 1.6 billion baseline, but when you get into 50%, he transitions to his heroic phase and heals back up to 66%. So originally in MOP, we're talking a health bar of about 1.85 billion on this boss. And this isn't just a pure single target hit the boss for the whole fight either. There are intermissions where players have to fly over to platforms to deal with some adds, and there are constant adds that have to be managed damaged in the final phase of the fight as well. The last phase is also a balancing act of making sure the ads are dealt with correctly by passing a buff around from player to player to clear a debuff from them. The world first of this fight from Method was over a 20-minute encounter, with plenty of wipes as things got out of control during those final few percentages. And I don't know about you, but this sounds terrible to have to reprogress that much of a boss fight before you could actually get to the bit you are finding difficult again. Even doing Ragnaros 25 heroic during Firelands on Kata Classic, it was 8 to 10 minutes of playing perfectly and having no one die to have another shot at the final phase and to improve on that. All in all, these boss fights that just last this long aren't fun to me, and it feels boring to go through the motions for such a long period of time again before seeing the part that's difficult. So really, just because of how unreasonably long this fight was, Shah of Fear deserves a place in this video. Next is an addition from the Cataclysm expansion. So the whole expansion had been building up to the inevitable fight versus Deathwing, similar to how Wrath had been building up to the inevitable encounter with the Lich King, but this time around it didn't go so well when it came to the actual fight, or fights, should I say. The pick for the number 3 spot though is the Spine of Deathwing. After parachuting down onto Deathwing's back, the idea was to use ads from the fight to blow the scales off of his back one by one. This would eventually make him weak enough to blast him out of the sky, and then he could go on to the Madness of Deathwing encounter. In practice though, this fight just felt a bit off. You know, it sounded cool on paper as a 2-part fight where Deathwing is so large that he couldn't be fought normally, and he had to be taken on in this way instead. It's especially interesting because in 11.2 on retail at the moment, they're working on the largest raid boss ever, Void Lord Dimensius, the same one we beat during that one quest in TBC over in Neverstorm, by the way. And I just wonder if people will say they felt as though they didn't fight Dimensius due to his size as they did with Deathwing. Just a thought though. Anyway, Spine had several annoyances. First of course was roll. If Deathwing detected too many players on one side, he would roll, which would insta-kill everything on his back, unless you were being held in place by a mechanic, and this would have to be performed on purpose to clear ads at certain points in the fight, but it could be frustrating to deal with. Second is that building up the large ad and then causing it to explode would temporarily expose an armor piece, which you then had to DPS down before it sealed itself again. This meant you had several burst windows where you needed extremely high on-demand DPS classes throughout the fight, and even if you just missed the DPS check by a little bit, you go and have to repeat the whole process again to expose the armor piece. Third is that the Spine of Deathwing is arguably more difficult of a fight when compared to the last boss, the Madness of Deathwing, and when you're just riding around on the boss's back killing ads, it doesn't really give you the impression of taking on the big final boss of the expansion. All in all, a huge final payoff 2-part encounter of Cataclysm just didn't quite hit the mark, and a penultimate fight akin to a chiropractic session didn't leave the best memories inside of players' minds. Next we're up to the top 2, so you know we're going into some highly questionable boss territory here. Here we have a boss which is the most recent out of anyone in the video so far as well, Stone Legion Generals Mythic. I think for most of us, if we saw this boss fight on Mythic, it would have been from when the Race to World First guilds were struggling with an enormous amount of wipes on this encounter. The first issues were bugs which could lead to the Wicked Blade mechanic that was supposed to bounce between 3 different players and not doing that. Instead it would just hit a singular player multiple times, which was instant death for that unfortunate individual. But the real issue on this encounter was the fact that the boss had spell queuing issues. Now chances are you've never had to deal with a boss where spell queuing actually meaningfully changed the encounter, and believe me, you don't want to. In fact, the only one I can think of where this happened during classic expansions is on Iron Council during Ulduar, if you did that on hard mode that is. So spell queuing simply means the boss wants to cast abilities in a certain order, but depending on several factors such as health percentage, phase changes, time between last ability cast and more, they can desync and start to cast their abilities in a different order, faster, or slower than anticipated. All in all, it removes a ton of predictability from the boss encounter and creates an environment where one pull to the next can lead to mechanics happening in a completely different way. And when you're progressing a mythic boss where mistake equals death, you must be able to predict what the boss will do next, or it becomes infinitely harder to deal with. And on top of this, a severe DPS check, tons of personal responsibility and cooldown management, and you have a true nightmare of a boss to progress, and one that really no Mythic raider has spoken of positively. Castle Nathria was overall an amazing opening raid tier to the less than popular Shadowlands expansion, and perhaps the only saving grace here is Stone Legion General's Mythic would have been a piece of content only seen by a tiny proportion of the player base. Which means at number 1, the worst designed boss in World of Warcraft's history has to go to an encounter which we have had the displeasure of revisiting during Classic already. This is from a boss in Icecrown Citadel, and is without a doubt the least fun I've ever had on any boss ever. Sindragosa 25 Heroic. First up, Cindy is a boss towards the end of the raid, meaning on your first kill it's actually quite challenging, and it's also fairly long at around 10 minutes or so for your first kill. Saying that, the boss feels longer than it needs to be, because outside of the last phase, which starts at 35%, the rest of the fight is pretty much free, and it's really difficult to wipe unless you do something super wrong. The problems on this fight were that it features several mechanics where you just had to stop DPS. Melee would get stacks from hitting the boss, including hunters. These weren't so bad because they had a short duration, but you did just have to stop attacking occasionally so they would drop off. For casters, however, the boss could just decide that you're not going to be playing the game. So there was a debuff called Unchained Magic that lasts 30 seconds. When you cast with this debuff, you gain stacks of a new debuff called Instability that lasts 5 seconds. The more you cast, the more stacks you get. And when Instability wore off, you do damage in a massive AoE zone around yourself. So when you got the Unchained Magic debuff, you had to spread out, and then maybe you could cast 2 or 3 spells before needing to let the debuff drop off again. This was unless the boss was forcing you to group up, which it did do for several mechanics. So then the optimal thing to do with Unchained Magic was nothing. Yep, you just stood there and waited for the debuff to go away, and this debuff would be on about 7 to 8 players at the same time, and you could get hit with this back to back as well. And just in case you were thinking of doing something this encounter, the boss would then fly away occasionally and target several players with ice prisons. This would stun you for about a further 30 to 40 seconds or so. You had to use these prisons to line of sight a Frost Blast too, so the people in them had to be left in them for the full duration. The boss would then come back and land, and obviously then it would hit you with Unchained Magic again, and then it would Frost Tomb you, and then it would fly away, and then it would Frost Tomb you again, and then it would come back, and then it would Unchained Magic you again. I had a pull on the PTR where I legitimately couldn't play the game for 5 minutes of this encounter. I wish I recorded it, it was so bad it was funny. Anyways, after about 7 minutes of these fun mechanics, the last phase of the fight starts where you have to carefully DPS the boss down whilst line of sighting behind Frost Tombs to drop debuffs. All in all, for the majority of your raid, Sindragosa 25 Heroic was just a super frustrating fight. People say they hate encounters where you're forced to stop DPS because you need to wait for a certain mechanic or for a push timing, but the whole of Sindragosa was just constant stopping and starting, and that's why, for me, Sindragosa 25 Heroic has to be the worst designed boss in WoW's history. With over 20 years of raiding content behind it, World of Warcraft has seen hundreds of bosses across dozens of raids. We now know that in Classic, things started off super simple. Maybe a boss would just put up some debuffs, or they'd hit the tank kind of hard in the odd fight here and there. Over time though, raiding has evolved massively. Nowadays, the race to World First is a huge event, with professional guilds putting in countless hours to perfecting every aspect of the raid. And with the leaps and bounds the game has made, raiding has changed a lot too. Even as early as Wrath of the Lich King, bosses started to become more challenging, with the hard mode difficulty in Ulduar, and later heroic in Trial of the Grand Crusader and beyond. And then later still in the Warlords of Draenor pre-patch, Blizzard introduced Mythic mode, which we've had ever since as the new standard for the hardest content in WoW. And as raiding grew, it started to become difficult. A lot more difficult. Gone were the days of just dispel the debuff and kill the boss in under a minute. Instead now we have multi-part abilities, personal responsibility, and a lot of overlapping mechanics. So today I want to talk about some of the toughest raid boss mechanics to deal with ever across all WoW expansions. These will be the most problematic abilities which often defined a fight, and made it so difficult to progress. So with that said, let's make a start. We'll begin with the iconic Lich King 25 heroic fight. ICC was a step up in raid difficulty for sure, but without a doubt the Lich King 25 heroic was the hardest piece of content Blizzard had made up to that point in time. It had DPS checks, raid-wide coordination, and the ever-dreaded personal responsibility. That's going to be a reoccurring theme here. But there was one mechanic on this fight which you could never underestimate. In fact, if this mechanic ever went wrong, you would wipe instantly, no matter how many weeks you had this content on farm. And that, of course, was Defile. So Defile was a big shadow pool the Lich King would cast on any random player in the raid. And on heroic, each time it dealt damage, it would grow in size and it would grow in damage as well. And basically, if it was allowed to tick and deal damage even once, it could grow in size and then accidentally hit another player, and then if that happened, it could accidentally hit another player, and at that point it was like a snowball that had got rolling, and it's probably going to be a wipe. The difficulty with Defile was that it could go on any player, even the main tank, so everyone had to hold their rocket boots cooldown for Defile, and just kind of pray you don't get it 2 times in a row if your class has weak mobility, because if you do, there's a reasonably high chance it ticks for damage if you're just running out of it. Just one more reason to always take engineering, I guess. Second is at times during the fight, Defile came out really shortly after your raid was forced to stack up, meaning the margin for error was much lower. And finally, you just really didn't have a ton of time to react after you were targeted with Defile, and slow reactions would always be punished by a raid wipe. These days, of course, we got to rely on weak auras to send off alarm bells when we were targeted, but I imagine it was way more difficult back in the day. By today's standards, Defile isn't too bad, but it can just be so punishing that I thought it deserved a spot on this list. Next, we're heading forwards one expansion into the Cataclysm for a revisit versus another end of raid boss, and this time it'll be versus Ragnaros 25 heroic in the Firelands. This is an absolute marathon of a boss fight featuring tons of overlapping mechanics, one-shots, and hey, personal responsibility again. Whilst Ragnaros gained a whole new phase on heroic where of course he grew some legs, it's not something specific to heroic or the final phase which I want to pick actually. It's a mechanic which you have to deal with in normal mode too, and even in normal it can be quite easy to wipe on this. And that mechanic is Molten Seeds. This was an ability that had several parts to it, and you had to deal with it in a really specific way. So you would stack your raid at one side of the boss in preparation for the Molten Seed cast. When the cast went off, which these days we have a weak aura telling us when it would, I've no idea what the tell for this cast happening is, I just moved when it told me to. Anyways, your entire raid would need to run around to the other side of the boss at basically the same time. A moment later, Molten Seeds would hit where your character used to be, where you were all stacked. This meant if you ran early, you put seeds ahead of the rest of your raid and hit people, and if you ran late, you would get mega one-shot. When your raid had reached the other side of the boss, you needed to use defensive cooldowns, as the Molten Seeds would explode and deal fall-off damage depending on how far away your raid was. However, you also still had to be in range of the Molten Seeds when they exploded because they would grow into adds, and then these had to be dealt with via ranged attacks before they were able to run towards the raid and reach any player. These adds were CC immune and gained a stacking debuff from being next to one another, so if they ever got in range of somebody, they just one-shot them. And you had to deal with this several times throughout the fight as well. This was just one of many abilities Ragnaros had that would either one-shot you or your entire raid depending on how wrong you did it. Even in Classic, this fight did not mess about when it came to difficulty. What made Molten Seeds hard to deal with was the several parts to the ability, each of which had to be executed perfectly every single time, or you could very easily lose people. And Rag 25 Heroic was simply not a fight where you could afford to make mistakes in the long run, because you needed as many people as possible for the final part of the encounter. Those were the two heroic fights I wanted to highlight. From here on out, it's all going to be about the mythic bosses, and I don't think that should be too much of a surprise really. Raiding difficulty has only gone up over the years, and even the absolute absolute best guilds in the world take some time to defeat the hardest bosses. Next we're visiting the Battle for Azeroth expansion for the Battle of Dazar'alor raid. Here I want to talk about what has to be one of the most unique fight mechanics we've ever seen in WoW, and that's when players face TIE Tinker Mecha Talk in battle. This fight already had some really nasty mechanical overlaps where you could easily lose players, and it also had a bunch of personal responsibility, because at the end of the day when one person out of a possible 20 can wipe the raid, it always makes a big difference. But the mechanic I want to highlight here are Mecha Talk's spark bots. So he would call these in periodically throughout the fight, and they would deal moderate raid-wide damage, but if enough of them spawned in, it became unhealable, so they had to be shut down. Shutting them down though was achieved in such an interesting way. So Mecha, being the master engineer he is, would use a shrink ray on certain players, making them tiny, and so they would take damage if other players stood on them. And when you were shrunk, you could hop into the spark bots as a vehicle. Each spark bot would have some coloured icons over their head, which would represent their shutdown sequence, and you could only see other spark bots icons over their head and not your own. So each player inside of a spark bot would have to call out the other's shutdown sequence so that it could be entered on their own spell bar. On Mythic mode you had to do 3 of these bots at the same time, and if you were too slow or put in the wrong sequence, you took a massive amount of damage and were ejected. And if you failed a bot early on, it was kind of a wipe because you were going to get overwhelmed by them. On top of that, random players were shrunk, so you couldn't just send in the same people all the time to deal with them. This just felt like such a standout raid mechanic which I always remember, and it could be pretty tricky to get the hang of at the same time, so that's why I think it deserves a spot here. Following that, we're going to be staying in the Battle for Azeroth expansion with a trip to the final boss of Azshara's Eternal Palace, Queen Azshara herself. Azshara had been a character in the WoW universe from well before the times when it existed as an MMO, so to finally have a proper fight versus her as a boss was always going to be a difficult encounter. The mechanic I want to highlight here is the intermission phase Queen's Decree. This would assign commands to players which they had to do, or they would take large amounts of ticking damage and die pretty fast. These included soaking an arcane orb, not soaking an arcane orb, standing next to other players, standing still, or standing alone. On normal you only had to do 1 of these at once, so it's pretty easy, but on heroic and mythic you had to do 2 of them at the same time, which massively complicated the fight because everyone would get 2 different callouts. The phase would start and you had a few seconds to figure out what every player in your raid should be doing, who needed to stack, run, stand alone, soak, not soak, and so on. Due to the time constraints of the mechanic happening and it being random who gets what, people just had to know what to do without being told, which always makes things so much more difficult. Obviously, a weak aura was developed to assign players to do certain actions, so you didn't really have to think about it that much and you could just follow what the weak aura said. A classic case of Blizzard making mechanics which inevitably will be dealt with through add-ons, not so much by the players in-game. Still, I don't think the existence of weak auras takes away from how difficult this mechanic was. In fact, it kind of proves the point that if players, even the best players, need to use add-ons to beat the mechanic, it's kind of hard. Overall, Mythic Azshara was a very long and super complicated fight, and learning this mini phase was just part of the bigger picture. Now I want to head over to Shadowlands in Castle Nathria for the Stone Legion General's encounter. This fight was renowned for its difficulty due to a spell queuing mechanic, where depending on how fast the boss was progressed, bosses would begin to cast their abilities in a different order, which massively complicated the fight. This fight was just difficult from start to finish. One of the main abilities that would get progressively harder to deal with as time went on was Reverberating Eruption. This would mark several players who would explode a few seconds later, leaving a zone behind where they stood called Unstable Ground that dealt minor ticking damage. On each cast of Reverberating Eruption thereafter, more players would be marked who would also have to take these marks out of the raid and drop them at the side of the arena. But on top of that, the previous zones would explode unless somebody was actively standing in them, and if you didn't have someone soaking one of them, it was a wipe. And you couldn't always have the same people soak either because you got a debuff from standing in the eruption. This meant you had some idea of which classes could soak early on, but after that it was just ensuring that when each set of new Reverberating Eruptions were cast, that all of them were soaked, or you instantly wipe and have to go again. These types of mechanics where your raid just has to non-verbally deal with them are always super difficult and really rely on your raiders being very experienced and understanding the fight perfectly. These eruptions of course happened close to other mechanical overlaps as well, putting even more pressure on the fight. Ultimately though, this was just another hard mechanic to deal with, even for the best raiders. Next I have an entry from, well, either Legion or BFA, depending on how you look at it. Blizzard have used this mechanic twice, as far as I know, and every time they do use this mechanic, it makes a boss way more challenging to complete. And this is essentially a matching pairs mechanic. So we're going to take the example from the Nighthold here with Star Augur Atreus. Throughout each phase, he would cast something called Grand Conjunction. This will put a mark over several players' heads, and they had to run to another player with the same mark within 10 seconds. Also, they couldn't run over a player with a different mark. If you were too slow or ran into a different mark, the marks would explode and you would wipe instantly. Every time the boss casts this ability in a phase, more players will be marked too, starting with just 8 players, so 4 pairs total. That's pretty easy to deal with, and then 12, which is over half your raid, and finally 16, meaning pretty much your whole raid has to go find a corresponding player. That would mean 16 players have 10 seconds to pair up with somebody else with the same mark as them, and if a single person gets it wrong, you wipe. I think you can imagine how this boss would have been an absolute nightmare to progress, even if you had just perhaps 1 or 2 weaker links on your mythic raid team. He also had an extreme DPS check early on. The world first of this in fact used 2 healers. It was overall a big wall of a fight within the raid, but the Grand Conjunction mechanic was very unforgiving and definitely made things way harder. Following that, we're going back an expansion to Warlords of Draenor. You simply can't have a video about difficult boss mechanics without including Mythic Archimonde in the mix somewhere. This was the final boss of the expansion and our second face-off versus Archimonde. However, this time around things were going to be a bit more difficult than they were in TBC. By far one of the most challenging mechanics on the fight was a mythic only ability, Wrought and Focus Chaos. This would mark pairs of players. These marks would affect every player within the raid and would fire a beam between them after 6 seconds, and then the marks would repick 2 new sets of player and fire a second beam within 6 seconds, and then it would repeat this a 3rd time in a row. So 10 beams are being shot across the raid 3 times in a row from potentially different points with a 6-second delay between each one. And if you get hit by 2 beams because somebody aims them wrong, you're going to start losing people, and you just couldn't afford to have that happen. Due to the time constraints of this mechanic happening in such a short space of time, you couldn't communicate what to do either, and as it affected random players, it was pretty difficult to pre-assign positions as well. This made Wrought and Focus Chaos arguably one of the most unfair mechanics we've ever seen in WoW up to this point in time. Top guilds, however, developed a special weak aura which will put an icon on screen that would show where each beam was going to be fired between each player, so you just had to look at this and know that you were safe. But similar to Ashara and her weak aura mechanic, this would have been extremely difficult to pull off without any add-on help. And this was before you even got to the mythic only phase of Archimonde either. Overall, a very challenging fight, which Warlords of Draenor wasn't short on, and it should only be right then that it has one of WoW's hardest mechanics ever. Now let's jump forwards again and visit the Shadowlands for the Sepulchre of the First One's raid and the Halondrus Mythic encounter. This fight had a new mechanic on Mythic, which took it from being relatively simple to absolute nightmare fuel, and this was because of volatile charges. These are bombs that would spawn in sets of 3 at the start of the phase, and then 3 more later in phase 2. Picking them up would deal a high amount of damage to the player and apply a minor dot. After you pick them up though, a timer starts where you have to drop the bomb again before the timer ends, or the bomb explodes. But when you put it back down again, you get a debuff which makes you take a massive amount of damage if you try and pick it back up again, and then another timer starts, so a second player has to go and pick it back up, which restarts the first timer. So you have multiple groups of 2 players juggling these volatile charges for basically the entire fight, and if anyone messes up ever, you wipe. If one player of a group dies, you're probably going to wipe because another player would have to fill in and flex. And on top of that, the boss itself was a serious DPS check and is also spamming its own mechanics which force players to change their positions frequently. You had to make sure you were dropping the bomb in a good place for your partner so they were able to pick it up easily without needing to walk into something which would cause them to take damage and probably end up killing them. This made Halondrus Mythic into a fight where you could really never relax. At any moment a bomb could go off and you'd felt as though you were never safe in securing the kill until the boss finally reached 0% health. Very tough fight to progress and a mythic only mechanic which made it significantly harder. Next we're going to Dragonflight for the most recent boss on this list. And number 2 is Mythic Tindral Sage Swift in Yggdrasil the Dream's Hope. This fight can only be described as being absolutely relentless. In fact, it took more pulls on average than the final boss due to how difficult it was. One of the key things to know about this fight is just how many deadly mechanics it had, and as soon as you were done dealing with one of them, he was already casting the next. The margin for error on Tindral was just non-existent. It was all about knowing and executing mechanics perfectly, whilst having a ton of personal responsibility at the same time. And one of the hardest mechanical crossovers here was for the Seeds of Flame. Throughout the fight, Tindral would summon a ton of fiery seeds on the platform. Players had 5 seconds to soak all of the seeds, and if any of them were missed, an ad would spawn that would wipe the raid a few seconds later. However, unlike normal or heroic mode where you could crush multiple seeds yourself by walking over them, on Mythic each player could only do 1, so you had literally a few seconds to ensure that every single seed was dealt with by a different member of your raid before going back to the boss and then more or less instantly getting another mechanic. There was an insane number of ways to wipe on this fight due to the pace of the mechanics and how little time you had to think in between them, but above all, Seed of Flame was one of the most punishing due to the time constraints and raid-wide coordination it needed. Which means at the number 1 spot we're heading back to Legion again for Kill Jaden Mythic. This is the end fight of the Tomb of Sargeras raid and has a reputation for being one of, if not the hardest WoW bosses ever, and he deserves that reputation. In fact, this boss was not beaten pre-nerf, as the damage on certain mechanic overlaps was just not possible to deal with at the time. What I want to talk about though is his mechanic, or specifically the intermission called Deceiver's Veil. This would have happened a good amount into the fight, about 10 minutes or so, and would cover the whole platform in shadow. During this time you had basically a few seconds to perfectly execute what needed to be done. First you had to locate Illidan within the shadow. He would be somewhere on the platform, you just have to assign players to go to different places and call it out. When you run up to him, he would grant players sight, enabling you to damage the ads. The ads had to be constantly interrupted and ideally grouped up, otherwise they would spam cast and teleport across the room, making them super annoying to kill. Whilst this was happening, orbs are falling at random edges of the arena that will knock you off the side unless you use some kind of movement ability to counter them. Of course, you're in complete darkness, you can't see where the orbs are going to fall, somebody just has to go and scout it and then communicate where they'll be, and you just need to know when you should use an ability to counter it. So all in all, you had very little time to find Illidan, interrupt and defeat the ads, and not get knocked off the platform, all whilst being in complete darkness and relying on your raid for their communications. Oh, and just for good measure, while you're in this phase, your raid is taking an absolutely massive amount of damage too. When you get out of this phase, Kil'jaeden says, "Somehow you survived." And yeah, I kind of agree with him. This whole intermission is just unfair, but those for me are 10 of the hardest raid mechanics we've ever seen in World of Warcraft.